You're listening to real, true crime stories told in the dark. No distractions, just the facts, the mystery, and the rain. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is. Now, close your eyes, relax, and let's dive into tonight's cases. The Circleville Letter Writer. Today we're traveling to the heart of Ohio to explore one of America's most persistent anonymous harassment campaigns. This is the story of the Circleville Letter Writer, a case that spans decades and leaves us questioning whether justice was ever truly served. In 1976, residents of the small town of Circleville, Ohio, began receiving anonymous letters. These weren't ordinary pieces of mail. They contained intimate details about the recipient's private lives, accusations of illicit affairs, and explicit threats. For nearly 2 decades, the Circleville Letter Writer tormented this community, leading to a suspicious death, multiple investigations, and an arrest that may have targeted the wrong person entirely. What makes this case particularly disturbing isn't just the content of the letters, but their accuracy. The writers seem to know details that only someone close to the victims could possibly know. This wasn't just harassment. It was psychological warfare waged by someone hiding in plain sight. Our story begins in 1976 when Mary Gillespie, a school bus driver in the Circleville School District, received an anonymous letter accusing her of having an affair with the district superintendent, Gordon Massey. The letter warned that if she didn't end the alleged relationship, her family would be in danger. Mary wasn't the only recipient. Her husband, Ron Gillespie, also received letters about his wife's supposed infidelity. The letters to Ron took a more menacing tone, questioning his manhood and taunting him about his wife's activities. What made these accusations particularly troubling was that, according to multiple accounts, Mary and Gordon actually had begun a relationship, though Mary would later claim it started only after the letters began. The letter writer somehow knew details that weren't public knowledge, suggesting the author was someone close to the family. Ron and Mary initially kept the letters to themselves. They hadn't told anyone about the harassment, not even their closest friends. Yet somehow, the anonymous writer knew not only about the letters, but about their reactions to them. In one chilling message, the writer stated, "I know you're upset about the letter." The Gillespies were trapped in an increasingly threatening situation with someone who seemed to be watching their every move. By August 1977, the situation had escalated. Ron Gillespie received a mysterious phone call that appeared to identify the letter writer. Whatever information Ron received that night clearly disturbed him. According to family members, he grabbed his gun and abruptly left the house, telling Mary he had to take care of something. Ron never returned home. Later that night, his car crashed into a tree. He was killed instantly. The official ruling was that Ron had a blood alcohol content of 0.16, suggesting he had been drinking heavily before the accident. However, friends and family insisted that Ron wasn't a drinker and claimed he had been sober that evening. Even more suspicious was the positioning of Ron's gun. It had been fired, but the coroner found no gunshot wounds on Ron's body. Was this truly an accident? Or had Ron confronted someone who then staged his death to look like a drunk driving incident? Following Ron's death, Mary received another letter. This one was perhaps the most disturbing of all. "You have had 2 weeks and have done nothing about the charges. Gillespie, stay away from Mr. Massey. Make him stay away from your house and make him leave you alone. Take care of your own damn kids. Their father is dead. If you don't, there will be more deaths in your family. You and your Mr. Massey." The letter writer not only showed no remorse for Ron's death, but seemed to be claiming responsibility while threatening more violence. As months passed, the scope of the letter campaign expanded. Mary's sister, Karen, received threats. Gordon Massey and his wife became targets. School board members, other bus drivers, and seemingly random Circleville residents began finding the crude, threatening letters in their mailboxes. The letters were distinctive: block capital letters, poor spelling, and often containing vulgar language. They were generally postmarked from Columbus, about 30 miles away from Circleville, making it difficult to trace their origins. By this point, the content of the letters had evolved. While they continued to focus on the alleged affair between Mary and Gordon, They also began containing accusations against other community members. The writer claimed to know about embezzlement at the school, sexual misconduct among teachers, and various other scandals. The fear in Circleville was palpable. Neighbors began to suspect each other. Friendships dissolved under the weight of accusations. The anonymous writer had achieved something remarkable, transforming a close-knit rural community into a hotbed of suspicion and fear. 6 years after the first letter arrived, the campaign against Mary Gillespie took an even more sinister turn. In February 1983, Mary was driving her regular school bus route when she noticed a sign posted along the road. The sign contained a message about her daughter. Mary stopped the bus, fortunately without any children aboard at that moment, and got out to remove the sign. What she discovered wasn't just another threat, but a potentially deadly trap. The sign had been rigged with a box containing a pistol. The crude device was designed so that removing the sign would trigger the gun to fire directly at whoever pulled it down. Through sheer luck, or perhaps because of the device's poor construction, the gun failed to discharge when Mary grabbed the sign. Mary immediately took the device to the local police. Investigators determined that the pistol was a .38 caliber revolver, fully loaded and operational despite its failure to fire. The serial number led them to an unexpected owner, Mary's former brother-in-law, Paul Freshour, who was married to Ron's sister. Paul insisted that the gun had been stolen months earlier, but he hadn't reported the theft. This wasn't the only red flag. Paul's handwriting seemed to match the block letters used in the anonymous notes. And perhaps most damning, he had access to information about the Gillespie family that had appeared in the letters that on February 25, 1983, Paul Freshour was arrested for the attempted murder of Mary Gillespie. During the trial, handwriting experts testified that Paul's writing matched the anonymous letters. The prosecution presented evidence that Paul had the mechanical knowledge to construct the booby trap and had been vocal about his dislike of Mary following Ron's death. Paul maintained his innocence throughout the trial. He claimed he was working at his job at a local water treatment plant when the sign was placed, and several co-workers confirmed his alibi. Nevertheless, the jury found him guilty. In October 1983, Paul was sentenced to 7 to 25 years in prison. With Paul Freshour behind bars, the people of Circleville hoped the nightmare was finally over. But their relief would be short-lived. Remarkably, even with Paul Freshour in prison, the letters didn't stop. Residents of Circleville continued to receive the threatening, accusatory messages. Even Paul himself received letters in prison, taunting him about being wrongfully convicted. Prison officials insisted it was impossible for Paul to be sending the letters. He was under constant surveillance and had no access to mailing materials. His mail was monitored, and he was even placed in solitary confinement for a time to prove he couldn't be the source. Yet during this period, the Circleville letters kept arriving in mailboxes. The prison warden was so convinced of Paul's innocence that he wrote a letter confirming that Paul could not possibly be continuing the letter-writing campaign from behind bars. Despite this clear evidence that someone else must be involved, the authorities made no serious effort to identify another suspect. Paul Freshour remained in prison, maintaining his innocence while the real letter writer presumably remained free. By the late 1980s, the scope of the letters had expanded dramatically. Anonymous messages were sent to neighboring towns and even to businesses in Columbus. Some were addressed to local media outlets and law enforcement agencies. The content evolved as well. While many still focused on affairs and sexual misconduct, others contained allegations of corruption in local government, claims about organized crime connections, and threats against prominent community members. In 1988, the case attracted national attention when it was featured on an episode of the television show Unsolved Mysteries. The segment included interviews with Mary Gillespie, law enforcement officials, and even Paul Freshour, who participated from prison. Following the broadcast, the show received an anonymous letter purporting to be from the Circleville writer. It read, "Forget Circleville, Ohio. Do nothing to hurt Sheriff Radcliffe. If you come to Ohio, you El Sickos will pay." The Circleville writer. The handwriting appeared to match the previous letters, confirming that the writer was still active and apparently watching the investigation unfold on national television. Paul Freshour was released on parole in May 1994, having served 10 years of a sentence. Despite being free, he continued his campaign to clear his name, maintaining that he had been wrongfully convicted not only of the booby trap, but of being the Circleville letter writer. Interestingly, following Paul's release, the letters appears to have stopped. Some took this as evidence that perhaps Paul had been the writer all along, and that the letters from during his incarceration had been written by an accomplice or sent with delayed delivery. Others pointed out that if Paul were guilty, it would make little sense for him to resume his public campaign for innocence while simultaneously stopping the anonymous harassment that might help prove his case. Paul Freshour died in 2012, never having been officially exonerated. To his last day, he maintained his innocence. Over the decades, numerous theories have emerged about the identity of the Circleville letter writer. Let's examine some of the most prominent ones. The most obvious suspect remains Paul Freshour, despite the seemingly impossible continuation of letters during his incarceration. Supporters of this theory suggest that Paul may have had an accomplice, perhaps a family member or friend who continued the campaign while he was imprisoned. Another theory focuses on Mary's husband, Ron Gillespie. Some have suggested that Ron discovered his wife's affair and began sending the letters himself, perhaps as a way to pressure her into ending the relationship without directly confronting her. This might explain the writer's intimate knowledge of the Gillespie family. However, this theory fails to explain why the letters continued long after Ron's death. Karen Freshour, Paul's ex-wife and Ron's sister, has also been suggested as a possible suspect. She would have had access to Paul's gun and knowledge of family matters. As Ron's sister, she might have held a grudge against Mary for her alleged affair. Some speculate that Karen might have framed Paul after their divorce. Sheriff Dwight Radcliffe, who led the investigation, has been the subject of speculation as well. The letters occasionally contained allegations of corruption within the sheriff's department, and critics have suggested that Radcliffe may have been too quick to focus on Paul Freshour to the exclusion of other suspects. Some even propose that Radcliffe himself might have been involved, either as the writer or in covering up the writer's identity. Finally, some believe the Circleville letter writer may have been a group rather than an individual. This could explain the varying writing styles sometimes noted in the letters and would make the continued letter campaign during Paul's incarceration easier to understand. Nearly 5 decades after the first letter appeared in Mary Gillespie's mailbox, the identity of the Circleville letter writer remains officially unsolved. While Paul Freshour was convicted of the booby trap incident, no one has ever been definitively identified as the author of all the letters. Many of the central figures in the case have now passed away. Mary Gillespie died in 2019. Gordon Massey, Sheriff Radcliffe, and of course Paul Freshour are all deceased as well. With them went whatever secrets they may have held about this baffling case. For younger residents of Circleville, the letter writer has become something of a local legend, a bogeyman from their parents' generation. But for those who lived through it, the terror was all too real. The letters themselves are now kept in evidence storage, their block capitals and crude language preserved as artifacts of one of Ohio's most peculiar unsolved mysteries. What kind of person would devote years, even decades, to such a persistent harassment campaign? Forensic psychologists who have examined the case suggest the writer likely suffered from obsessive tendencies and possibly paranoid delusions. The letters reveal someone deeply preoccupied with moral judgments, particularly around sexuality and infidelity. The writer positioned themselves as a righteous crusader, exposing hypocrisy while simultaneously demonstrating voyeuristic interest in the intimate details of others' lives. The escalation from letters to a potentially deadly booby trap suggests the writer's frustration may have grown when their campaign failed to achieve the desired results. This progression from psychological to physical attempts at harm is a pattern seen in other stalking cases. Perhaps most disturbing is the writer's apparent omnipresence in the small community. They seem to know not just public information but private conversations, reactions to the letters, and intimate family details. This suggests either an extensive surveillance effort or, more likely, that the writer was someone close to the victims, a neighbor, friend, or family member hiding in plain sight. The Circleville letters case represents something uniquely disturbing. the weaponization of a community's secrets. Small towns like Circleville operate on an intricate web of relationships where privacy is often an illusion. Everyone knows everyone else's business, but social conventions prevent these matters from being openly discussed. The letter writer shattered this delicate balance, dragging private matters into public view and forcing confrontations that might otherwise have been avoided. In doing so, they destroyed not just individual relationships, but the sense of trust that bound the community together. This case also highlights the devastating power of anonymous harassment, particularly in the pre-internet era. Today, online harassment and cyberstalking receive significant attention, but the Circleville letter writer demonstrates that anonymous campaigns of fear have deep historical roots. For the citizens of Circleville who lived through this ordeal, the scars remain. Many still check their mailboxes with a sense of dread, half expecting to find crude block letters spelling out their most private secrets or threatening their loved ones. The case of a Circleville letter writer remains one of America's most persistent unsolved mysteries. Was Paul Freshour wrongfully convicted? Did the Rain letter writer escape justice entirely? Or was the truth even more complex, involving multiple writers or conspirators? Without new evidence or a deathbed confession, it seems unlikely we'll ever know for certain. The letter writer took advantage of small-town dynamics, exploiting the close-knit nature of the community to gather information while using its size to hide in plain sight. What we do know is that for nearly 2 decades, an anonymous writer wielded fear as a weapon, turning neighbor against neighbor and transforming ordinary mail delivery into a source of terror. The power of the written word has rarely been demonstrated in such a sinister fashion. As we conclude our exploration of this baffling case, we're left with the same questions that have haunted Circleville for generations. Who was watching? Who was writing? And why did they dedicate so much of their life to terrorizing a small Ohio town? The answers, like so many of the writer's secrets, remain sealed in envelopes that may never be opened. The Green River Killer, America's deadliest serial killer introduction along the winding banks of the Green River in King County, Washington, a dark chapter of American criminal history, began to unfold in the summer of 1982. What started with the discovery of a single victim would eventually reveal one of the most prolific serial killers in United States history, Gary Leon Ridgway, known as the Green River Killer. For nearly 2 decades, Ridgway prowled the streets of the Seattle area, targeting vulnerable women and evading capture while law enforcement desperately pursued a phantom. His eventual confession to 49 murders shocked the nation, though investigators believe the true number of his victims may be significantly higher. This is the story of Gary Ridgway, a seemingly ordinary man who led an extraordinary double life as America's deadliest serial killer, the decades-long investigation that finally brought him to justice, and the devastating impact his crimes had on countless families and an entire community. Early life and background. Gary Leon Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah, to Mary Rita Steinman and Thomas Newton Ridgway. The family later moved to the Seattle area, where Gary spent most of his formative years in the suburb of SeaTac, Washington. From the outside, the Ridgway household appeared normal, but behind closed doors, a complex and troubled dynamic was at play. Ridgway's childhood was marked by significant challenges. He struggled academically, with an IQ reportedly in the low 80s, and had difficulty with reading and writing. These learning difficulties made school a source of frustration and humiliation. By his teenage years, Ridgway had developed disturbing behavioral patterns. He was known to set fires and, more alarmingly, to harm animals, behaviors that are now recognized as potential warning signs in the development of violent offenders. Perhaps most troubling was Ridgway's relationship with his mother. By his own later admission, he harbored deeply conflicted feelings toward her. He was simultaneously attracted to and repulsed by her, emotions that psychological profilers would later suggest influenced his attitudes toward women. His father, a bus driver, was frequently away from home, and their relationship was strained and distant. As a teenager, Ridgway had at least one violent fantasy about his mother. He later recounted to investigators that he had once approached her from behind with a knife, contemplating violence. before turning away. This disturbing incident went unreported and unaddressed. After graduating from Tyee High School in 1969, Ridgway joined the Navy and served a brief stint in Vietnam. Military service provided structure, but did little to address his underlying psychological issues. After his discharge, he returned to the Seattle area and began working as a painter at the Kenworth Truck Factory, a job he would hold for nearly 30 years, presenting to colleagues an image of reliability and steadiness that belied his secret life. That Ridgway's personal relationships followed a pattern of instability. He married 3 times, and all 3 marriages ended in divorce. His first marriage in 1970 lasted only 1 year, while his second marriage in 1973 produced a son, but ended after 7 years. His third marriage began in 1988 and lasted until 2002, ending shortly after his arrest. Throughout his adult life, Ridgway maintained a facade of normalcy. Neighbors and co-workers described him as quiet and unremarkable. He was known to attend church regularly and could often be seen reading his Bible during lunch breaks at work. This carefully constructed persona helped him avoid suspicion for many years, even as the bodies of his victims began to accumulate along the Green River and surrounding areas. The murders begin the killing spree that would eventually earn Gary Ridgway his notorious title began in the early 1980s, a period marked by significant social and economic changes in the Seattle area. The region was experiencing a boom in its sex work industry, particularly along the Pacific Highway South, also known as the Seattle-Tacoma Strip or Highway 99, which ran through King County. This strip became Ridgway's primary hunting ground. That on July 15, 1982, 2 boys riding bicycles near the Green River made a grim discovery: the body of 16-year-old Wendy Lee Caulfield floating in the water. Her body showed signs of strangulation, with her own clothing used as a ligature. This method would become a signature element in many of Ridgway's murders. Caulfield, who had been involved in sex work, represented the demographic that would become Ridgway's preferred target: young women working in the sex industry or otherwise living on the margins of society. In the weeks that followed, more bodies emerged. On August 12, 1982, the remains of 23-year-old Deborah Lynn Bonner were found, also in the Green River. 3 days later, on August 15th, authorities made an even more disturbing discovery: 3 bodies found in a single day along the riverbank: Marcia Chapman, Cynthia Hines, and Opal Mills. The proximity of these victims and their similar causes of death indicated to investigators that they were likely dealing with a serial killer. As summer turned to fall in 1982, the body count continued to rise. The remains of Giselle Levorn, Terry Milligan, and Mary Meehan, who was 6 months pregnant at the time of her murder, were discovered in various locations in King County. Each victim had been strangled, and many showed signs of having been posed after death. Another characteristic that would become associated with the Green River Killer, Ridgway's method of operation, was as calculated as it was cruel. He would typically approach women working along Pacific Highway South, gain their trust, and offer them money for sex. Once alone with his victims, he would strangle them, often from behind, using his arm or a ligature. After killing them, he would transport their bodies to remote dump sites, primarily in wooded areas around King County. In some cases, he would return to the remains, engaging in necrophilia with his victims, a detail he later confessed to investigators. As 1982 drew to a close, the community was gripped by fear. Local media began covering the murders extensively, and the unknown perpetrator was given the moniker the Green River Killer due to the location where the first victims were discovered. What no one realized at the time was that Gary Ridgway was just beginning his reign of terror, and the worst was yet to come. The investigation begins as the bodies continue to accumulate along the Green River and throughout King County. Local law enforcement recognized the gravity of the situation. In January 1983, the Green River Task Force was officially formed to investigate what was clearly the work of a serial killer. The task force, initially comprising of detectives from the King County Sheriff's Office, would eventually grow to become one of the largest and most expensive serial murder investigations in American history. Detective Dave Reichert, who would later become King County Sheriff and eventually a U.S. Congressman, was among the original members of the task force. Reichert's dedication to the case would span decades, and he would eventually lead the team that finally brought Ridgway to justice. Other key investigators included Detective Tom Jensen, who spent nearly his entire career working on the Green River case. The task force faced significant challenges from the outset. The victims were primarily women involved in sex work, a population that was both transient and vulnerable. Many had unstable living situations and irregular contact with family, meaning their disappearances sometimes went unreported for extended periods. This made establishing accurate timelines difficult. Additionally, the killer was strategic in his disposal of victims. Bodies were left in remote wooded areas, often near ravines or bodies of water, where natural elements and wildlife accelerated decomposition. Some remains were not discovered until months or even years after the murders had taken place, further complicating the investigation. As the death toll rose throughout 1983 and 1984, the task force employed various investigative techniques. They interviewed hundreds of sex workers who worked along Pacific Highway South, hoping to identify anyone who had encountered the killer and survived. They compiled lists of suspicious Johns reported in the area and began building a database of potential suspects. In 1984, the task force received assistance from the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, including renowned profiler John Douglas. The profile they developed suggested the killer was likely a white male in his late 20s to 30s who lived or worked in the area, had average to above average intelligence, and likely presented a non-threatening demeanor that allowed him to gain the trust of his victims. Despite these efforts, the investigation faced criticism. Some community members and victims' families felt that because many of the victims were involved in sex work, their cases weren't given the priority they deserved. These criticisms led to increased community activism and eventually to greater resources being allocated to the task force. By 1985, the Green River Killer had claimed at least 48 known victims, though the true number was likely higher. In 1986, with no arrests made despite the massive investigation, the task force reached out to another notorious serial killer for insight. Ted Bundy, awaiting execution in Florida, offered to provide his perspective on the Green River Killer. In a series of interviews with Detective Reichert, Bundy suggested that the killer was likely returning to his victims' bodies after death and would probably be monitoring the dump sites and possibly even attending the victims' funerals. Despite Bundy's assistance and the task force's tireless efforts, the Green River Killer remained at large. As the 1980s progressed, the frequency of murders appeared to slow, leading some to speculate that the killer had died, been imprisoned for another crime, or moved away from the area. In reality, Gary Ridgway was still active, but had become more careful about body disposal, making his later victims harder to find. Gary Ridgway as a suspect while the Green River Task Force was pursuing hundreds of leads and investigating numerous potential suspects. Gary Ridgway had already come to their attention. His first contact with the investigation occurred in 1983 when the girlfriend of one of the victims reported that she had seen her friend get into a pickup truck similar to Ridgway's. Ridgway was interviewed by detectives in 1984 and denied any involvement in the murders. He admitted to frequently soliciting sex workers in the area, but maintained that he had nothing to do with the disappearances. During this interview, Ridgway voluntarily provided hair and saliva samples for testing, a confidence that suggested either innocence or extreme calculation. At the time, DNA testing was still in its infancy and not yet sophisticated enough to link Ridgway conclusively to the crimes. The samples were stored, however, and would prove crucial years later. Despite being on a list of potential suspects, Ridgway did not become a prime focus of the investigation. He had no significant criminal record, just a 1982 arrest for soliciting an undercover police officer posing as a sex worker, and he maintained a stable job and home life. His seemingly ordinary existence helped him avoid intense scrutiny. Ridgway was polygraphed in 1984 and passed the test, further reducing investigators' suspicions. What they didn't know was that Ridgway had practiced controlling his responses to prepare for the test, a technique that psychopaths have been known to use successfully. Throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, as the Green River killings appeared to taper off, Ridgway continued his life in plain sight. He worked diligently at his painting job at Kenworth, attended church, and maintained his third marriage. To neighbors and coworkers, he was simply Gary, quiet, unremarkable, and certainly not someone they would suspect of being a prolific serial killer. What those around him didn't see was his continued predatory behavior. While the frequency of his killings may have decreased, Ridgway later admitted that he never stopped hunting for victims. He had simply become more careful about where he disposed of the bodies, choosing more remote locations, and sometimes traveling to other counties to reduce the connection to the Green River cases. The Green River Task Force was scaled back in the early 1990s as leads dwindled and resources were redirected to other cases. However, a small group of dedicated detectives, including Tom Jensen, continued to work the case. They reviewed evidence, followed up on new leads, and kept the investigation alive, believing that advances in forensic science might eventually provide the breakthrough they needed. Their persistence would ultimately pay off as the dawn of advanced DNA testing approached, technology that would finally expose Gary Ridgway's deadly secret life and bring closure to dozens of families who had waited decades for justice. The breakthrough after nearly 2 decades of investigation, the breakthrough in the Green River Killer case came thanks to advances in forensic science. In 2001, the King County Sheriff's Office, under the leadership of Sheriff Dave Reichert, decided to re-examine evidence using newly developed DNA testing techniques. Specifically, they employed a relatively new test that could extract DNA profiles from microscopic samples. This test was applied to the saliva sample that Gary Ridgway had voluntarily provided back in 1984, comparing it with DNA evidence found on several of the victims that on November 30th, 2001, the results came back with a definitive match. Ridgway's DNA matched semen found on 4 of the earliest victims: Marcia Chapman, Opal Mills, Cynthia Hines, and Carol and Christensen. After nearly 2 decades of investigation, hundreds of thousands of man-hours, and millions of dollars spent, investigators finally had their killer. Gary Ridgway was arrested on his way home from work at the Kenworth Truck Factory, where he had been employed for 32 years. To many of his co-workers, the news came as a complete shock. The quiet, Bible-reading colleague they had worked alongside for decades was alleged to be one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Initially, Ridgway was charged with the murders of the 4 women whose cases had DNA evidence. He maintained his innocence, and his defense team prepared for what promised to be a lengthy and complex trial. The prosecution, led by King County Prosecutor Norm Malone, announced they would seek the death penalty. However, behind the scenes, negotiations were underway that would lead to an unprecedented plea deal. In exchange for Ridgway's full cooperation, including providing details about all his crimes and helping locate the remains of still missing victims, prosecutors agreed to take the death penalty off the table. Instead, Ridgway would receive multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. This controversial decision was not made lightly. Malone, who had previously been a strong proponent of capital punishment in appropriate cases, explained that the deal offered something more valuable than Ridgway's execution. It provided answers and closure to the families of dozens of victims whose cases might otherwise never be solved. In 2003, Gary Ridgway pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. Though in his confession, he claimed that he had killed so many women that he had lost count, estimating the total to be 60 or more. At the time, this made him the most prolific confirmed serial killer in American history, as part of his plea agreement. Ridgway worked with investigators over a period of months, providing details about his crimes and leading police to the remains of victims who had never been found. These Green River tours, as they became known, were surreal scenes. The handcuffed killer walking with investigators through remote wooded areas, pointing out where he had disposed of bodies years earlier. Some of the recovered remains were so minimal that they could only be identified through DNA testing. In several cases, Ridgway's information allowed families who had waited decades to finally give their loved ones proper burials. On December 18, 2003, Gary Ridgway was sentenced to 48 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus 480 years, 10 years for each victim. The sentencing hearing was emotional, with family members of victims given the opportunity to address Ridgway directly. Some expressed their anger and pain, while others shared memories of the loved ones he had taken from them. Ridgway himself spoke briefly, offering an apology that many found hollow given the enormity of his crimes. "I'm sorry for the scare I put into the community," he said, a statement that seemed to trivialize the lives he had destroyed. With Ridgway's conviction and sentencing, one of the longest and most complex serial murder investigations in American history came to a close. But for the families of his victims and the investigators who had dedicated their careers to the case, the impact of the Green River Killer would continue to resonate for years to come. Psychology of a killer understanding what drove Gary Ridgway to commit his horrific crimes has been a subject of intense study by forensic psychologists and criminologists. Unlike some serial killers who display obvious signs of mental instability, Ridgway presented a particular challenge due to his ability to function normally in society while harboring deeply disturbing violent tendencies. During extensive interviews following his arrest, Ridgway revealed aspects of his psychology that helped explain, though never excuse, his actions. His statements to investigators, combined with psychological evaluations, painted a portrait of a man with a toxic combination of pathologies. Ridgway exhibited classic signs of antisocial personality disorder, including a profound lack of empathy and remorse. He viewed his victims not as human beings with lives and families, but as objects to be used and discarded. In his own words, he hated prostitutes and viewed killing them as his career. This dehumanization allowed him to commit murder repeatedly without experiencing the guilt or emotional distress that would affect most people. His attitudes toward women were deeply contradictory and disturbed. While he claimed to hate sex workers, he was also a frequent customer. Psychologists noted that this contradiction stemmed partly from his complex relationship with his mother, whom he later described as domineering and sexually inappropriate. He admitted to having violent fantasies about her during his adolescence, fantasies that later manifested in his crimes against women. Ridgway's sexual development was marked by dysfunction. He had an unusually high sex drive, which his second wife described as insatiable. Yet he also harbored deep shame and rage related to sexuality. This combination of hypersexuality and anger created a volatile psychological cocktail that fueled his violent impulses. Perhaps most disturbing was Ridgway's admission that he derived pleasure not just from the act of killing, but from the knowledge that he had the power to take lives and escape detection. He told investigators that he would sometimes return to the dump sites to have sex with his victims' bodies, a particularly disturbing form of necrophilia that underscored his complete objectification of women. Intelligence testing revealed that Ridgway had a below-average IQ, estimated between 82 and 90. This led some observers to question how he had managed to evade capture for so long. The answer seems to lie not in intellectual brilliance, but in a combination of careful victim selection, geographical knowledge of the area, and a methodical approach to his crimes. He targeted individuals who were less likely to be reported missing immediately, disposed of bodies in remote locations he knew well, and varied his disposal sites to avoid establishing obvious patterns. Ridgway also displayed an unsettling ability to compartmentalize his life. He could commit a murder and then return home to have dinner with his family or report to work the next day without any apparent psychological distress. This compartmentalization allowed him to maintain his facade of normalcy for decades. During his confession, Ridgway showed little emotion when describing his crimes in clinical detail, but became animated and engaged when discussing the mechanics of how he had evaded detection. This suggested that his pride in outsmarting law enforcement was a significant motivating factor, a common trait among serial killers who derive satisfaction from the cat-and-mouse game with police. Despite extensive analysis, some aspects of Ridgway's psychology remain opaque. When asked why he stopped killing, or at least slowed down, in the 1990s, he gave inconsistent answers. Some experts speculate that his third marriage provided a level of stability that temporarily reduced his violent impulses, while others suggest he simply became more careful about victim selection and body disposal, making his later crimes harder to detect and linked to the Green River cases. What remains clear is that Gary Ridgway represents an extreme and disturbing case study in criminal psychology. A man who could appear utterly ordinary to those around him while harboring and acting upon the most violent impulses. His case continues to inform the study of serial killers and has helped law enforcement develop more sophisticated approaches to identifying and apprehending such predators before they claim as many victims. The victims and their legacy behind the shocking statistics and headline-grabbing details of the Green River Killer case lies a more important story, that of the lives cut short by Gary Ridgway's actions. The true tragedy of this case extends far beyond the criminal himself to the dozens of women and girls who lost their futures and the hundreds of family members and friends who lost loved ones that Ridgway's known victims ranged in age from 15 to 38. With the majority being in their teens and early 20s. While media coverage often focused on the fact that many were involved in sex work, this one-dimensional portrayal failed to capture the full humanity of these individuals. They were daughters, sisters, mothers, and friends. Many have been driven to sex work by difficult circumstances, including poverty, addiction, and in some cases, histories of abuse. Others were runaways or hitchhikers who crossed paths with Ridgway by tragic chance. Among them was Deborah Lynn Bonner, 23, whose friends called her Dub. Despite her struggles with addiction, she maintained close relationships with her family and dreamed of one day becoming stable enough to regain custody of her young daughter. Marie Malvar, 18, had recently moved to Seattle and turned to sex work temporarily to save money for her own apartment. Wendy Caulfield, 16, the first identified victim, had run away from a foster home and was trying to survive on her own when she encountered Ridgway. The investigations into these disappearances often revealed how systems had failed these vulnerable young women long before they became victims of a serial killer. Social services were inadequate, resources for at-risk youth were limited, and law enforcement sometimes viewed cases involving sex workers with less urgency than other missing persons. The Green River case eventually helped change these institutional attitudes. As family members advocated for their missing loved ones and the case gained national attention, it highlighted the need for more equitable treatment of all missing persons cases, regardless of the individual's background or circumstances. Several families of victims became powerful voices for change. The parents of Deborah Estes, who disappeared in 1982 at age 15 and whose remains weren't found until 1988, established a foundation to help at-risk youth and advocate for improved resources for families of missing persons. Similarly, the family of Rebecca Marrero, who vanished in 1982 but whose remains weren't identified until 2011, became outspoken advocates for continued investigation of cold cases. The investigation itself also evolved in response to criticisms about how the cases of these women were handled. The Green River Task Force eventually adopted more victim-centered approaches, working more closely with sex workers in the area to gather information and warn of dangers, rather than treating them as criminals. In the years since Ridgway's conviction, efforts have been made to memorialize the victims beyond their connection to their killer. In 2003, a memorial was established in Lincoln Park in Seattle, featuring bronze maple leaves inscribed with each victim's name. This garden of peace provides a place for families and community members to remember these women as individuals, not just as victims of the Green River Killer. Perhaps the most important legacy of these victims is the way their cases have influenced modern approaches to serial murder investigations. Lessons learned from the Green River case have been incorporated into training for law enforcement nationwide, including the importance of taking all missing persons reports seriously regardless of the individual's background, the value of maintaining evidence for future testing with yet-to-be-developed technologies, and the critical need for agencies to share information and coordinate efforts when patterns emerge. Through these changes in procedural approaches, institutional attitudes, and community awareness, the women who lost their lives to Gary Ridgway have had a lasting impact far beyond their tragic deaths. While nothing can restore the futures that were stolen from them, their cases have helped ensure that future victims of violent crime particularly those from vulnerable populations, will be more likely to receive the justice and dignity they deserve. The conclusion, the case of Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, stands as one of the most disturbing chapters in American criminal history. From the discovery of the first victims in 1982 to Ridgway's eventual confession in 2003, the case spanned more than 2 decades, claimed at least 49 lives, though the true number may never be known, and fundamentally changed how law enforcement approaches serial murder investigations. That Ridgway's reign of terror exposed vulnerabilities in society and in the criminal justice system. His ability to target marginalized women, many involved in sex work or otherwise living on society's edges, highlighted how certain populations can become invisible to protective institutions. The initial struggles of the investigation demonstrated the challenges of tracking a killer who specifically chose victims whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed or vigorously pursued. Yet the case also revealed the power of persistence and scientific advancement. Despite scaling back the task force as leads dwindled in the 1990s, dedicated investigators like Dave Reichert and Tom Jensen never gave up. Their decision to retest evidence using newly developed DNA technology finally brought Ridgway to justice, proving that even the most careful predators can eventually be caught as science evolves. The controversial plea deal that spared Ridgway the death penalty in exchange for his cooperation remains a subject of debate. While some viewed it as an unacceptable compromise with a monster who deserved the ultimate punishment, others recognized the value it provided to victims' families. Dozens of families who might never have known what happened to their loved ones finally received answers, and numerous victims' remains were recovered and given proper burials thanks to information Ridgway provided. Today, Gary Ridgway continues to serve his 48 consecutive life sentences at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. In the years since his conviction, he has occasionally provided additional information about victims, though many investigators believe he has yet to disclose the full extent of his crimes. The legacy of the Green River case extends beyond the fate of its perpetrator. It has informed how law enforcement agencies approach pattern crimes, particularly those targeting vulnerable populations. It has influenced public awareness about the need to protect at-risk individuals and to take all missing persons cases seriously. And it has underscored the value of preserving evidence for future testing with yet-to-be-developed technologies. Perhaps most importantly, the case serves as a sobering reminder of the capacity for evil that can exist behind the most ordinary facade. Gary Ridgway, the quiet factory worker, the churchgoer, the seemingly average neighbor, harbored deadly secrets that claimed dozens of lives before he was finally brought to justice. His case reminds us that vigilance and a commitment to protecting society's most vulnerable members remain essential in preventing such tragedies in the future. For the families of Ridgway's victims, no conclusion to this case could ever bring true closure. The pain of their losses continues decades later. But in the resolution of the investigation, in the memorials established to honor the victims, and in the lessons learned that may help prevent future tragedies, there exists at least some measure of justice and remembrance for those whose lives were cut short by the Green River Killer. In the dense forests of the northern Sierra Nevada mountains sits Keddie, California, a former resort town that would become infamous for one of the most brutal and baffling murder cases in American criminal history. On the morning of April 12, 1981, a crime scene of unimaginable horror was discovered in Cabin 28 at the Keddie Resort, a scene so disturbing that it changed the small community forever and continues to haunt investigators decades later. The story begins with the Sharps, a family seeking a fresh start. Glenna Sue Sharp, a 36-year-old mother of 5, had recently separated from her husband and moved from Quincy to the more affordable Keddie Resort with her children. The resort itself was already past its prime by 1981, a collection of aging cabins that had once been a vibrant vacation destination in the 1950s, but had since declined into low-income housing. Cabin 28 was home to Sue and 4 of her 5 children: 15-year-old John, 14-year-old Sheila, 12-year-old Tina, and 10-year-old Greg. Sue's oldest son had remained with his father after the separation. By all accounts, the family was well-liked in the community. Sue was described as a devoted mother working hard to rebuild her life. and the children were adjusting to their new surroundings, making friends with other kids at the resort on the evening of Saturday, April 11th, 1981. The Sharp family went about their normal activities. Sheila was invited to stay overnight at a friend's cabin nearby. The boys, John and Greg, were at home with their mother. John had invited his friend, 17-year-old Dana Wingate, to stay the night. 12-year-old Tina was also at home. The family had no way of knowing that this ordinary evening would be their last. The next morning, Sheila returned from her sleepover, eager to tell her mother about her night. What she discovered would forever alter the course of her life. Upon entering cabin 28, Sheila found the bodies of her mother Sue, her brother John, and his friend Dana Wingate in the living room. The scene was one of extraordinary violence. All three victims had been bound with electrical wire and medical tape. They had been stabbed repeatedly and bludgeoned with at least 2 different hammers. Sue and John had been stabbed so forcefully that the knife blades had bent. Dana Wingate had been strangled before being stabbed and beaten. The walls and furniture were splattered with blood. Most chilling of all, Sheila's youngest brothers, Greg, and his friend Justin Smart, who had also spent the night, were found alive and physically unharmed in an adjacent bedroom. Somehow, they had slept through or were unaware of the brutal attack that had taken place just feet away. But there was one more horrifying detail. 12-year-old Tina Sharp was nowhere to be found. The discovery launched what would become one of the most extensive investigations in Plumas County history. Law enforcement agencies from across Northern California converged on Ketty. The crime scene was processed, witnesses were interviewed, and a search for Tina began. The investigation revealed several puzzling aspects that continue to confound criminologists to this day. First was the matter of the missing murder weapons. Investigators believed at least 2 different knives and 2 different hammers had been used in the killings, suggesting multiple attackers. A bent steak knife was found at the scene, but other weapons were never recovered. Then, there was the selective violence. Why were Greg and Justin left unharmed in the back bedroom? Some investigators speculated that the killers might have known the boys, or, for some unknown reason, deliberately spared them. Others suggested the boys might have seen something, but were too traumatized or frightened to speak about it. The most disturbing element was Tina's disappearance. Had she been abducted during the attack? Was she a specific target? Or had she simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time? Forensic examination of the cabin revealed signs of a prolonged and fierce struggle. Sue Sharp and John had fought desperately for their lives. Blood spatter analysis suggested that the attack had gone on for some time and had moved throughout the cabin's main room. Despite this violence, neighbors in the closely positioned cabins reported hearing nothing unusual that night. No screams, no sounds of struggle, nothing to suggest the horror unfolding in cabin 28. The only potential witness account came from Justin Smart, Greg's friend who had stayed over that night. In the days following the murder, Justin began to describe dreams or memories of the attack. He spoke of multiple attackers, including at least one woman. He described seeing Sue Sharp being beaten and mentioned that one of the attackers had referred to another as Marty. However, Justin's account was problematic. His descriptions changed over time, and given his age and the traumatic nature of the event, investigators were uncertain how much weight to give his statements. Months passed with no sign of Tina Sharp and no arrests in the murder case. Then, in April 1984, nearly 3 years to the day after the murders, a breakthrough came in the most tragic form possible. A worker at a remote dumping site in Feather Falls, about 50 miles from Ketty, discovered a human skull. Subsequent searches recovered more remains, and dental records confirmed what many had feared. The remains belonged to Tina Sharp. The discovery of Tina's remains raised as many questions as it answered. The remote location suggested someone with local knowledge. Medical examiners could not determine the exact cause of death due to the condition of the remains, but the circumstances strongly suggested she had been murdered. The area where she was found had been searched previously, leading some investigators to speculate that her remains had been moved or only disposed of there later. As the investigation continued, several suspects emerged. The primary focus fell on Martin Smart and his friend, John Beau Babade, a man with alleged connections to organized crime in Chicago. Martin had been living in Ketty with his wife Marilyn and her son Justin, the same Justin who had been in cabin 28 during the murders. Interestingly, Martin had moved his family out of Ketty just days after the murders, and he and Marilyn divorced shortly thereafter. Several pieces of circumstantial evidence pointed to Martin Smart. He reportedly had argued with Sue Sharp in the days before the murders. He owned a hammer that went missing around the time of the killings, a hammer he claimed he had lost while doing repairs. Most damning was a statement allegedly made by Martin to his therapist that he had killed the woman and the kids were witnesses, so he had to kill them too. John Babade also fell under suspicion. He had moved in with Martin shortly before the murders and left town immediately afterward. He had a criminal record and claimed to have connections with organized crime in Chicago. Some investigators believed that Babade's criminal experience might explain the methodical nature of parts of the crime. Despite these suspicious circumstances, no arrests were made. Martin Smart died in Portland in 2000. Babade died in Chicago in 1988. Both went to their graves, never having been charged in the Ketty murders. The case grew cold, and for many years it seemed the truth about what happened in Cabin 28 might never be known. The resort itself declined further following the murders. Most cabins were abandoned, and in 2004, Cabin 28 was demolished, erasing the physical space where the horror had occurred, but not the memories or questions that lingered. Then, in 2013, more than 30 years after the murders, the case was reopened. Sheriff Greg Hagwood and Special Investigator Mike Gamberg began reviewing the evidence with fresh eyes. What they found was troubling. Key pieces of evidence had gone missing from the original investigation. Reports that might have pointed to viable suspects had been ignored or misplaced. The crime scene had been compromised early on, with personal items being removed before a thorough processing could occur. The renewed investigation made several significant discoveries. A hammer matching the description of Martin Smart's missing tool was found in a pond near the old Ketty Resort. New DNA testing was conducted on the surviving evidence. Perhaps most importantly, investigators uncovered a letter written by Martin Smart to his wife Marilyn after he left Ketty. In it, he apologized for the violence at the cabin, but blamed it on Babade, writing that he hadn't known Babade would go that far. While not a direct confession, the letter strongly suggested Martin's involvement. Interviews with Marilyn Smart revealed more troubling information. She admitted that Martin had hated Sue Sharp and had made threatening comments about her. She also stated that Martin had burned some bloody clothing shortly after the murders. When asked why she hadn't come forward with this information during the original investigation, Marilyn indicated she had told the lead detective, but her statements were never documented. This led to perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case's reinvestigation, the possibility of official misconduct or even a cover-up. The original lead detective, Doug Thomas, had connections to Martin Smart and Marilyn. They had socialized together, and there were rumors of other, more inappropriate relationships between the detective and Marilyn. Some have suggested this personal connection led to a deliberately compromised investigation. The new investigation team also discovered that anonymous calls had been made to the Plumas County Sheriff's Office on the night of the murders, suggesting something was happening at Cabin 28. These calls were never properly documented or investigated at the time. In 2016, investigators revealed that they had recovered a recording from an anonymous caller who claimed to know where Tina Sharp was buried, a call made before her remains were discovered. The location described matched where her remains were eventually found. This suggested that someone with knowledge of the crime had reached out to authorities, but this lead was also never properly pursued. The case remains officially unsolved, though the reinvestigation has narrowed the focus to Martin Smart and John Babade as the most likely perpetrators. The motive remains unclear. Some theories suggest that Martin's animosity towards Sue was the primary driver, while others propose that Tina was the main target, with the other murders committed to eliminate witnesses. One theory that emerged during the reinvestigation involves potential drug activity. Plumas County in the early 1980s was known for marijuana cultivation, and some investigators have suggested the murders might have been connected to illegal drug operations. However, no concrete evidence has emerged to support this theory. Another troubling possibility is that the Ketty murders might be connected to other unsolved crimes in the area. Several disappearances and murders occurred in Plumas and surrounding counties during the same period, and some investigators have noted similarities in methodology. However, without definitive evidence linking these cases, such connections remain speculative. For the survivors, the murders and the decades-long search for answers have exacted a devastating toll. Sheila Sharp, who discovered the bodies, has spent her adult life processing the trauma of that April morning. In interviews, she has described how the murders shaped every aspect of her life. Her relationships, her perspective, her sense of safety. She has become an advocate for the victims of violent crime and has worked to keep the case in the public eye, hoping that full closure might someday be possible. Greg Sharp, who survived the attack by virtue of being in another room, has largely avoided public statements about the case. The psychological impact of knowing he slept through the murders of his mother and brother, and possibly his sister, is unimaginable. The other surviving Sharp children have also carried the burden of this tragedy. Each is coped in their own way, but all have lived with the knowledge that those responsible for destroying their family may have escaped justice. In 2018, the Plumas County Sheriff's Office announced that they considered the case solved in the sense that they had identified the perpetrators as Martin Smart and John Babade. However, with both men deceased and some evidence still missing or compromised, official closure in the form of arrests and trials will never be possible. The site where Cabin 28 once stood is now empty, but the memory of what happened there continues to haunt the community. The remaining cabins of the Ketty Resort were finally demolished in 2019, erasing the last physical remnants of the location, though not the memories of what occurred there. The Ketty Cabin murders represent a particular kind of American tragedy, brutal, seemingly senseless violence erupting in a quiet community, destroying innocent lives, and leaving survivors to piece together what happened and why. It speaks to our deepest fears about the vulnerability of domestic spaces, about the possibility that evil can intrude into the places where we should feel safest. Perhaps what makes this case so enduring is not just its brutality or mystery, but what it reveals about justice delayed and potentially denied. For years, viable suspects were overlooked. Evidence was mishandled or lost. Leads were ignored. Whether through incompetence, corruption, or some combination of factors, the system failed the Sharp family. And yet, decades later, dedicated investigators refused to let the case die. Their persistence has provided some measure of resolution, even if complete justice is now impossible. The truth about what happened in Cabin May 28th will never be fully known, but the efforts to uncover that truth speak to our collective need for closure and accountability, no matter how much time has passed. The woods around where Ketty once stood remain as they were in 1981, dense, beautiful, and occasionally shrouded in mist. Travelers passing through the area might never know the tragedy that occurred there if not for the case's infamy. The resort is gone, the cabin demolished, but the questions linger like ghosts among the trees. Who enters a family's home in the dead of night with murder in mind? What darkness drives such violence? And how do we make sense of senseless brutality? For some, the case represents a failure of justice. For others, it serves as a warning about the darkness that can exist in human hearts. But for those who knew and loved Sue, John, Dana, and Tina, it remains something much more personal, an open wound that time has not healed, a loss that cannot be measured, and a series of questions that deserve answers. Even after all these years, I'm in the mountains of Plumas County, where winter snows can bury evidence and secrets alike. The memory of Cabin 28 persists, a reminder that some stories refuse to end, even when their setting has been erased and their protagonists have passed from this world. The Ketty Cabin murders may be consigned to history, but for many, they remain as vivid and troubling as they were on that spring morning in 1981 when a teenage girl opened a cabin door and found a nightmare that would never truly end. The Yuba County Five, a wilderness of Keystone in February 1978. 5 young men from Yuba City, California vanished after attending a basketball game. Their subsequent fate, dying in the snowy wilderness miles from home despite having access to shelter and supplies, has puzzled investigators for over 4 decades. What began as a simple trip to watch basketball transformed into one of America's most perplexing mysteries. Before we dive into the mystery, let's meet the five men at the center of this tragic tale. Gary Mathias was 25 years old, a former Army serviceman who struggled with mental health issues, including schizophrenia, but had been stable on medication. His friends described him as kind and dependable when he stayed on his treatment plan. Jack Madruga, 30, was a steady, reliable man who worked at a local box factory. He owned a 1969 Mercury Montego, which the group would use for their fateful trip. William Sterling, 29, known to friends as Bill, worked alongside Jack at the box factory. He was described as gentle and somewhat childlike due to mild intellectual disabilities. Theodore Weiher, 32, was a special education aide who still lived with his family. Standing at 6 feet 5 inches, he was physically imposing but had the gentle demeanor of someone who worked with children. Finally, there was Jackie Hewitt, 24, the youngest of the group. Like Bill, he had developmental disabilities but maintained a job at a local supermarket. What united these five men was their love of basketball. They played together on a team called the Gateway Gators in a league for developmentally disabled adults. On the evening of February 24th, 1978, they planned to attend a UC Davis basketball game about 50 miles from their hometown. None of them would ever return home. The evening began routinely enough. The five friends piled into Jack's Mercury Montego and headed toward Davis to watch the game between UC Davis and Chico State. They stopped at a local market where they bought snacks and drinks for the game. Security footage captured them looking relaxed and happy. However, for reasons that remain unclear, the men never made it to the basketball game in Davis. Instead, they drove in the opposite direction. Their journey would eventually take them to Plumas National Forest, nearly 70 miles northeast of their intended destination. This wasn't just a wrong turn. It was a complete reversal of their planned route, leading them into increasingly remote mountain territory as a winter storm approached. What compelled five men familiar with the area to drive in precisely the wrong direction? This is the first of many questions that have never been satisfactorily answered. The first break in the case came on February 28, 1978, for days after the men disappeared. A forest ranger discovered Jack's Mercury Montego on a snow-covered road in the Plumas National Forest, an elevation of about 4,500 feet. The car was stuck in a snowbank, but there were several puzzling aspects about the scene. First, the car was only superficially stuck. Investigators later determined that a group of able-bodied men could have easily pushed it free. Second, the car had plenty of gas and was in perfect working order. Third, it was found on a stretch of road called Oroville-Quincy Highway, which was well-maintained even in winter. Even more baffling was what they found inside the car. Maps, cigarettes, Jack's wallet containing cash, and the uneaten snacks purchased for the basketball game. There were no signs of violence or struggle. The car was unlocked, with the keys missing from the ignition. Strangest of all was the location itself, 28 miles from the nearest town of Brownsville, in the opposite direction for where the men had intended to go. How did they end up so far off course? And why would they abandon a functioning vehicle with supplies during a snowstorm? The discovery of the car triggered an immediate search operation. Helicopters scanned the area while ground teams with tracking dogs combed the forest. Heavy snowfall complicated efforts, but searchers expected to find the men relatively quickly. 5 individuals leaving tracks in snow should have been easy to locate, but no footprints were found around the car. The snowfall had been heavy enough to cover any tracks, suggesting the men had abandoned the vehicle at least 24 hours before its discovery. Search efforts expanded over the following weeks. Family members joined professionals in combing miles of rugged terrain. Missing person flyers appeared throughout Northern California. Yet despite one of the most extensive search operations in the region's history, no trace of the 5 men emerged. As weeks passed with no sightings, hope began to fade. Some speculated the men had been victims of foul play. Others suggested they might have fled to start new lives. But the truth would prove far stranger than any of these theories. An essential piece of this puzzle involves a Forest Service trailer located approximately 19 miles from where the car was found. This facility known locally as the Forest Mountain Trailer, served as a construction camp during summer months. In winter, it was abandoned but remained fully stocked with food, propane for heating, and beds. Most critically, the trailer had a propane-powered heating system that could easily have sustained 5 men through the winter storm. Inside were enough canned goods to last for weeks, comfortable beds, and a radio that could have been used to call for help. Here's what makes this detail so significant. Search party members discovered that someone had used the trailer after the men disappeared. Wrappers and evidence suggested visitors had been there, but the trailer hadn't been used as a long-term shelter. Why would 5 men caught in a snowstorm not take full advantage of this life-saving refuge? This question becomes even more perplexing when we consider what was found next on June 4th, 1978, over 3 months after the disappearance. A group of motorcyclists exploring the area made a grim discovery. They found the body of Theodore Weiher in a Forest Service trailer, but not the same one mentioned earlier. This trailer was located 19.4 miles from the abandoned Mercury. Ted's body was found on a bed inside the trailer, covered with sheets. He had lost nearly 100 pounds and appeared to have died from a combination of starvation and exposure. The coroner estimated he had survived for up to 13 weeks after the disappearance, dying just weeks before his body was discovered. The scene inside the trailer presented investigators with even more puzzling evidence. Ted's shoes were neatly placed beside the bed. His body was covered with blankets, suggesting someone had been caring for him. More mysteriously, there was evidence that someone had been using the trailer's facilities. The trailer had a propane tank with an adequate supply to heat the structure. Dozens of ration food tins were found opened, and empty matches and cigarettes were found. Wrappers and other evidence suggested occupancy outside. Searchers found Ted's wallet with identification, but no money. Most baffling of all, approximately 100 feet from the trailer stood a storage shed containing enough food to feed all 5 men for a year. This cache included freeze-dried meals, canned goods, and other non-perishable items. For some inexplicable reason, it appeared that neither Ted nor anyone with him had discovered this life-saving supply. Following the discovery of Ted's body, search efforts intensified once again. Over the next 3 weeks, the bodies of 3 more of the missing men were located. Jackie Hewitt was found approximately 2 miles from the trailer, scattered by scavengers. Bill Sterling's remains were discovered nearby in a wooded area. Jack Madruga's body was located a similar distance away. All 3 had apparently died from exposure and hypothermia. Forensic analysis suggested they had died relatively soon after the disappearance in February, unlike Ted, who had survived for months. But the mystery deepened further. Gary Mathias, the 5th member of the group, was never found. Despite extensive searches that continued sporadically for years, no trace of Gary, not even clothing or personal effects, was ever discovered. Gary's disappearance adds another layer to this already bewildering case. If he survived longer than the others, what became of him? If he died in the wilderness, why was his body never recovered when the others were found in relatively close proximity? Some investigators have speculated that Gary, who had military training and was physically fit, might have attempted to hike out for help. Others suggest more sinister possibilities, that he might have been responsible for the strange circumstances surrounding his friends' deaths. But without evidence, these remain merely theories. The discovery of the bodies only multiplied the questions surrounding the case. Among the most perplexing, why would 5 men drive 70 miles in the wrong direction from their intended destination? Why would they abandon a functional vehicle that was only superficially stuck in snow? Why didn't they use the car's heater to stay warm until help arrived or the storm passed? Why would they leave the relative safety of their car to trek 19 miles through deep snow in a winter storm? If they found shelter in the trailer where Ted's body was discovered, why didn't they utilize the heating system or search more thoroughly for food? Why were Ted's shoes removed and placed neatly by the bed? Why would 4 able-bodied men fail to discover a storage shed full of food just 100 feet from where they sought shelter? Why was Gary Mathias never found? And perhaps most importantly, what could possibly have motivated 5 men to make such catastrophically poor decisions when better options were readily available? Adding to the mystery are several witness reports from the night of the disappearance that might shed light on what happened, or might further complicate an already perplexing case. Joseph Shones, a 55-year-old man from Forbstown, reported that his car became stuck in snow on the same road where the mercury was later found. This happened around midnight on February 24th, just hours after the men were last seen. Shones told investigators he suffered a mild heart attack while trying to free his vehicle. As he rested in his car, he observed another car, potentially the Mercury, pull up behind him with its lights on. He said he saw what appeared to be a woman and a baby, as well as several men. When Shones called out for help, the lights were turned off, and the people vanished into the darkness. Shones then claimed to have seen flashlight beams moving around in the woods for several hours as he drifted in and out of consciousness in a BY morning. Shones had recovered enough to free his vehicle and drive home. He reported his experience to the police only after learning about the missing men days later. This account raises even more questions. Who was the woman with the baby that Shones claimed to see? Were these the 5 men? And if so, who were the others with them? Why would they ignore a stranded motorist calling for help? Some investigators dismiss Shones' account as the confused recollections of a man experiencing cardiac distress. Others believe it may provide crucial insight into the men's final hours. Over 4 decades, numerous theories have emerged to explain the baffling circumstances of the Yuba County 5. None fully account for all the peculiarities of the case, but each offers potential insight. The first and most straightforward explanation is that the men simply got lost. After missing the turn for Davis, they might have become increasingly disoriented, eventually finding themselves on an unfamiliar mountain road as night fell. When their car became stuck, they panicked and made a series of poor decisions that ultimately proved fatal. However, this theory fails to explain why they would leave a functional vehicle or why they wouldn't utilize the resources available in the trailer where Ted's body was found. A second theory focuses on Gary Mathias' mental health. As a diagnosed schizophrenic, he might have experienced a psychotic episode that influenced the group's decisions. Perhaps he became paranoid or delusional, convincing the others to abandon the car and hide in the wilderness. His friends, accustomed to following his lead and trusting his judgment, might have complied with catastrophic results. That a third possibility involves an encounter with someone else in the forest, perhaps the woman and baby that Joseph Shones claimed to have seen. This encounter might have frightened the men or led them to assist someone in trouble, drawing them deeper into the wilderness. Some investigators have proposed more sinister theories involving foul play. Could the men have witnessed something they weren't supposed to see, such as a drug transaction or other criminal activity? Might they have been pursued into the wilderness and forced to flee for their lives? Finally, some suggest a hybrid explanation. Perhaps the men did encounter someone on the road, and this encounter, combined with Gary's potential mental health issues, created a perfect storm of confusion and poor decision-making. The official investigation concluded that the men simply got lost and died from exposure, a tragic accident resulting from a series of unfortunate decisions. This is the explanation favored by most law enforcement officials who work the case. However, many family members and some investigators remain unconvinced. They point to the numerous inconsistencies and unanswered questions that make this case so perplexing. Yuba County Sheriff's Department officially closed the case after the discovery of the bodies, classifying the deaths as accidental. Despite periodic reviews over the years, no new evidence has emerged to change this classification. The case of the Yuba County 5 has left an indelible mark on the communities of Yuba City and beyond. For the families of the 5 men, closure remains elusive. They've endured not only the loss of their loved ones, but also decades of unanswered questions. For search and rescue professionals, the case has become a cautionary tale about the dangers of panic and poor decision-making in wilderness situations. It's studied as an example of how quickly things can go wrong when people abandon the relative safety of a vehicle. For true crime enthusiasts and amateur sleuths, the Yuba County 5 represents one of America's most enduring mysteries, a case with enough strange details and unanswered questions to fuel decades of speculation. The wilderness area where the tragedy unfolded remains largely unchanged. Hikers and campers in Plumas National Forest occasionally report feeling an unusual solemnity in the area where the men perished. Some claim to have heard phantom voices or seen unexplained lights, stories that add a supernatural dimension to an already mysterious case. What truly happened to Gary Mathias, Jack Madruga, William Sterling, Theodore Weiher, and Jackie Hewitt remains unknown. We have a timeline of their final months and days, but the crucial questions, the why questions, continue to elude us. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of this case is how preventable the tragedy seems in hindsight. At multiple points, different decisions might have saved 5 lives: staying with the car, properly utilizing the trailer's resources, discovering the nearby food storage. The Yuba County 5 reminds us of the fragility of human judgment in crisis situations. It stands as a testament to how quickly ordinary circumstances can transform into extraordinary mysteries. As we conclude our exploration of this haunting case, we're left with questions that may never be answered. What caused 5 men to make decisions that ultimately cost them their lives? What happened during those final days and hours? And what became of Gary Mathias, whose fate remains unknown to this day? Some mysteries persist, not because evidence is lacking, but because the evidence we have defies logical explanation. The case of the Yuba County 5 may well be such a mystery, a wilderness of questions with no clear path to answers. Remember that sometimes the most ordinary people can become entangled in the most extraordinary mysteries. In the aftermath of World War I, as soldiers returned home and America attempted to return to normalcy, the city of New Orleans found itself gripped by a terror unlike any it had experienced before. Between May 1918 and October 1919, an unidentified killer prowled the streets of the Crescent City, breaking into homes in the dead of night and attacking sleeping victims with their own axes or straight razors. This mysterious predator would come to be known as the Axeman of New Orleans, and his reign of terror would become one of America's most chilling unsolved serial murder cases. New Orleans in 1918 was a city of contrasts. Famous for its vibrant culture, music, and celebrations, it was also a place of deep divides. Racial tensions, class distinctions, and ethnic prejudices shaped daily life. The city had a substantial Italian immigrant population, many of whom operated small grocery stores in various neighborhoods. These hardworking families would become the Axeman's primary targets, though the reason for this preference remains one of the many unanswered questions surrounding the case. The terror began on May 22, 1918, when Italian grocer Joseph Maggio and his wife Catherine were found brutally murdered in their apartment above their grocery store on Upper Street. Their throats had been cut with a straight razor while they slept, and an axe covered in blood was found at the scene. The axe belonged to the victims. The killer had taken it from their shed before entering the home. This pattern, using the victims' own tools against them, would become the Axeman's signature. It suggested a killer who arrived empty-handed but left drenched in blood. Adding to the mystery, the Maggio's home showed no signs of forced entry, and though their safe had been tampered with, nothing of value appeared to be missing. Initial suspicion fell on Andrew Maggio, Joseph's brother, who discovered the bodies. He had traces of blood on his clothing, which he claimed came from embracing his brother's body. Andrew was eventually cleared when subsequent attacks occurred while he was in custody. The second attack came just over a month later, on June 27th, when Louis Bessumer and his alleged wife Harriet Lowe, later discovered to be his mistress, were struck with an axe while sleeping in their quarters above Bessumer's grocery. Both survived the initial attack, though Harriet Lowe died weeks later from complications. Before her death, in her morphine-induced delirium, she accused Bessumer of being the Axeman and a German spy, a serious accusation in the climate of World War I-era America. Bessumer was arrested but later released when another attack occurred while he was in jail. On August 5th, a pregnant woman named Mrs. Edward Schneider was attacked in her sleep by an axe-wielding intruder. She survived, as did her unborn child. Just 5 days later, on August 10th, the attacker struck again, battering elderly Joseph Romano with an axe. Romano's nieces witnessed a dark figure fleeing the scene, but could provide only vague descriptions. Romano died 2 days later from his injuries. The city was now in a state of panic. Italian grocers in particular were terrified, with many families taking turns standing guard at night. The attacks seemed to defy explanation. They weren't clearly motivated by robbery, sexual assault, or any obvious grudge. The fact that many victims survived suggested the killer wasn't particularly competent, yet he consistently evaded capture, slipping away into the night like a phantom. Then, just as mysteriously as they had begun, the attacks stopped. For 6 months, New Orleans cautiously returned to normal life. Some speculated the killer had died or left the city. Others feared he was merely biding his time. These fears were realized on March 10, 1919, when Charles Cortimiglia, his wife Rosie, and their 2-year-old daughter Mary were attacked in their home in Gretna, a suburb across the Mississippi River from New Orleans. Charles and Rosie survived, but little Mary died from her head wounds. In a shocking turn, Rosie Cortimiglia accused their neighbors, Frank and Angelina Giordano, of the crime. Based solely on her testimony, both were convicted, Frank sentenced to hang and Angelina to life imprisonment. Months later, Rosie recanted her testimony, admitting she had accused the Giordanos out of jealousy and spite. They were released, but the damage to their reputations was irreparable. Just 3 days after the Cortimiglia attack, the case took its strangest turn yet. On March 13, 1919, the New Orleans Times-Picayune published a letter purportedly written by the axeman himself. The letter was a bizarre, taunting message to the people of New Orleans. Esteemed mortal, it began. They have never caught me, and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. I'm not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell. The letter continued with increasingly bizarre claims about the killer's supernatural nature, but it was the final paragraphs that truly captured the public's attention and secured the axeman's place in New Orleans folklore. Now, to be exact, at 12:15 earthly time, on next Tuesday night, I'm going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I'm going to make a little proposition to you people. Here it is. I'm very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well then, so much the better for you people. One thing is certain, and that is that some of your people who do not jazz it on Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe. The letter was signed simply the Axeman. The response from New Orleans residents was immediate and dramatic. On the night of March 19, 1919, the city erupted with jazz music. Dance halls were packed to capacity. Homes throughout the city blared jazz from phonographs. Those who could play instruments formed impromptu bands. Even those who despised jazz made an exception that night. No one wanted to test whether the axeman's letter was a hoax. True to the letter's word, no attacks occurred that night. But whether this was because of the jazz or because the axeman had never planned to attack remains unknown. The letter itself remains a subject of debate among crime historians. Was it actually written by the killer, or was it a hoax perpetrated by a newspaper seeking to boost circulation? The flowery language and theatrical tone seem at odds with the brutal, seemingly impulsive nature of the crimes themselves. The respite was short-lived. On August 10, 1919, the axeman returned, attacking grocer Steve Boca as he slept. Boca survived, but could provide no description of his attacker. On September 3rd, Sarah Lawman, a 19-year-old, was attacked while alone in her home. She survived, but had no memory of the attack due to her injuries. The final attack attributed to the axeman came on October 27, 1919, when Mike Pepitone was murdered with an axe while sleeping next to his wife. Mrs. Pepitone glimpsed a dark figure fleeing, but could provide no detailed description. This would be the last known attack by the axeman of New Orleans. Like many serial killers, he simply stopped or moved elsewhere, leaving his identity a mystery that persists to this day. In total, the axeman attacked at least 12 people, killing 6. The attacks shared notable similarities. They typically occurred in the early morning hours. The victims were attacked while sleeping. The murder weapon was usually an axe belonging to the victims, and there was rarely any sign of forced entry. Most victims were Italian Americans, and many were grocers, the investigation was hampered by several factors. Forensic science was in its infancy in 1918 to 1919. There was no DNA analysis, no reliable fingerprinting, and crime scene preservation was minimal. The New Orleans police force of the era was also notoriously corrupt and incompetent, more focused on vice raids than solving complex murders. Additionally, the focus on Italian victims led some investigators down unproductive paths. Theories about Black Hand and early mafia extortion schemes abounded, despite little evidence connecting the victims to organized crime. The era's rampant prejudice against Italian immigrants colored both the investigation and the media coverage, with many assuming the crimes must be connected to what they viewed as the inherently violent nature of Italian organized crime. Over the years, several theories about the Axeman's identity have emerged. One of the most persistent centers on a man named Joseph Montfort. According to this theory, Montfort was shot and killed by the widow of Mike Pepitone, the Axeman's last victim, in Los Angeles in 1921. Proponents of this theory claim Montfort was a blackmailer connected to the Black Hand who had been targeting Italian grocers. However, modern researchers have cast serious doubt on this theory. There are no contemporary records of a Joseph Montfort being killed in Los Angeles in 1921, nor is there evidence that Mrs. Pepitone ever left New Orleans. The Montfort story appears to have been fabricated years later and mistakenly accepted as fact by subsequent researchers. Another theory suggests the killer might have been Louis Ubicon, a man convicted in August 1918 of attacking a woman with a meat cleaver. He was released from prison in December 1918, before the second wave of Axeman attacks began. However, there is little evidence beyond timing to connect Ubicon to the Axeman crimes. Some researchers have proposed that there was no single Axeman, but rather a series of copycat crimes. The widely varying descriptions of suspects, the inconsistent levels of violence, and the broad geographic spread of the attacks could support this theory. The Jazz Letter might have been written by someone with no connection to any of the crimes, further muddying the waters. The impact of the Axemen on New Orleans was profound and lasting. The attacks changed how people lived their daily lives. Doors that had once been left unlocked were now bolted. Weapons were kept within reach at night. Neighbors formed watch groups. Italian grocers in particular lived in constant fear, with some selling their businesses and leaving the city. The jazz connection, whether fabricated or real, became inextricably linked with New Orleans culture. The night of March 19, 1919, when the entire city played jazz to ward off a killer, has become part of the city's musical lore. Local composers even created a song called The Mysterious Axeman's Jazz, Don't Scare Me Papa, capitalizing on the hysteria. The case also reflected and exacerbated the social tensions of the era. The focus on Italian victims highlighted the prejudice faced by these immigrants. Some residents blamed the crimes on African Americans, despite no evidence supporting this. Others saw the hand of organized crime, reinforcing stereotypes about Italian-Americans. As time passed and the attack stopped, the Axeman gradually transformed from a real threat into a figure of urban legend. Stories about his superhuman abilities, entering locked rooms, vanishing into thin air, grew more elaborate. He joined the pantheon of New Orleans supernatural lore alongside voodoo queens and restless spirits. Modern interest in the Axeman case has surged with the popularity of true crime media. The case has been featured in books, podcasts, documentaries, and even fictionalized in the television series American Horror Story, Coven. Each retelling adds layers to the legend, sometimes at the expense of historical accuracy. Cold case researchers continue to sift through the limited surviving evidence, hoping modern forensic techniques might shed new light on the century-old mystery. However, with most physical evidence lost, witnesses long dead, and records incomplete, a definitive identification of the Axeman seems unlikely. What makes the Axeman case so enduringly fascinating is not just the mystery of the killer's identity, but what the case reveals about the society it terrorized. The attacks exposed the fault lines of 1910's New Orleans, the ethnic tensions, the inadequate policing, the sensationalist media, and the superstitions that still held sway in the modern era. The Axeman also represents a transitional figure in the history of American crime. He emerged at a time when the concept of a serial killer was not yet fully formed in the public consciousness or in law enforcement methodology. The inability to profile, track, or understand such a killer reflected the limitations of early 20th century criminology. Today, the French Quarter tour guides of New Orleans still point out locations connected to the Axeman. The former grocery stores where families were attacked have been converted into restaurants, homes, and shops, their bloody history known only to those who seek it out. The victims, Joseph and Catherine Maggio, Harriet Lowe, Joseph Romano, Mary Cortimiglia, Mike Pepitone, and others, are largely forgotten as individuals, subsumed into the larger legend that a century later, the jazz plays on in New Orleans. But the identity of the man who once demanded it as tribute remains hidden in the shadows of history. The Axeman, whoever he was, took his secrets to the grave. All that remains is the legacy of fear he created, the lives he destroyed, and the enduring mystery that continues to haunt the imagination of anyone who encounters this dark chapter in the history of the Crescent City. Deep in the Bavarian countryside, nestled among rolling hills and dense forests, stood a farmstead known as Hinterkaifeck. Remote and isolated, the farm sat about half a mile from the nearest neighbor and a mile from the village of Grobern. It was here, in the spring of 1922, that one of Germany's most perplexing and macabre murder cases unfolded. A case that remains unsolved to this day, continuing to haunt the imagination of true crime enthusiasts a century later. The Gruber family had worked the land at Hinterkaifeck for generations. In 1922, the household consisted of 63-year-old farmer Andreas Gruber, his 72-year-old wife Cazilia, their widowed daughter Victoria Gabriel, who was 35, Victoria's two children, 7-year-old Cazilia and 2-year-old Joseph, and a new maid, 44-year-old Maria Baumgartner. The family was known in the area as reclusive and somewhat strange, but hardworking and prosperous by the standards of rural Bavaria in the post-World War I era. Andreas Gruber was a difficult man, stubborn, controlling, and not well-liked by his neighbors. Rumors circulated about his relationship with his daughter Victoria, whispers that suggested an incestuous relationship that may have produced little Joseph. The child's birth certificate listed no father, and local gossip pointed to Andreas. Whether these rumors had any basis in truth, they contributed to the family's isolation and the complex web of theories that would later surround their murders. Strange occurrences began plaguing Hinterkaifeck in the days leading up to the killings. Around March 21st or 22, Andreas told neighbors about discovering unfamiliar footprints in the fresh snow leading from the edge of the forest to the farm, but curiously, no footprints leading back. He also mentioned hearing footsteps in the attic and finding an unfamiliar newspaper on the property that no one in the family had purchased. A set of house keys went missing. Most bizarrely, when the family's previous maid quit 6 months earlier, she claimed the house was haunted, having heard strange noises and sensing uncanny presences. Despite these unsettling occurrences, Andreas didn't alert the police. Perhaps he was too proud or too wary of authorities to seek help. Instead, he searched the farm buildings himself, but found nothing. The family continued with their daily routines as winter gave way to spring, seemingly unaware of the horror that awaited them. But on the evening of March 31st, 1922, a brutal and methodical killer or killers descended upon the isolated farmstead. The new maid, Maria Baumgartner, had only arrived at Hinterkaifeck that very day, having been hired after the previous maid quit. She would not live to see the morning of her second day of employment. The sequence of murders appears to have been carefully orchestrated. Investigators later determined that Andreas, his wife Cazilia, his daughter Victoria, and her daughter, little Cazilia, were lured to the barn one by one, where they were killed with a mattock, a tool similar to a pickaxe. The killer then entered the house, where they murdered the maid, Maria, in her bedroom, likely as she prepared for bed. Finally, the killer found 2-year-old Joseph in his crib and killed the toddler with the same weapon, striking his head with such force that the ceiling above the crib was spattered with blood. The most chilling aspect of the Hinterkaifeck murders wasn't discovered until investigators had pieced together the timeline of events following the killings. For it appeared that the killer hadn't fled after committing this atrocity, but had instead remained at the farm for several days afterward. The bodies weren't discovered until April 4th, nearly 4 days after the murders. Concerns arose when young Kazilia missed several days of school, and neighbors noticed that although smoke had been rising from the chimney, no one had been seen around the farm. A mechanic named Albert Hoffner arrived to repair a feed-cutting machine as previously arranged and, finding no one to greet him, alerted neighbors. When people finally entered the property, the scene that greeted them was both gruesome and bizarre. The 4 bodies in the barn had been carefully stacked and covered with hay. Inside the house, Maria Baumgartner lay in her bed, while little Joseph remained in his crib. But what truly unsettled investigators were the signs of continued habitation after the murders. Someone had fed the cattle in the days between the killings and the discovery of the bodies. Smoke had been seen coming from the chimney, suggesting fires had been maintained. Food had been eaten from the kitchen. Neighbors reported seeing smoke from the chimney over the weekend, and even observing someone walking around the farm. Most disturbing of all, when investigators checked the farm's finances, they discovered that someone had taken the time to carefully note down all the family's financial transactions after the murders, keeping the farm's meticulous records up to date. The investigation into the Hinterkaifeck murders was hampered by several factors. Forensic science in 1922 was primitive by modern standards. The crime scene had been disturbed by the various people who discovered the bodies. The isolated location of the farm meant there were few, if any, witnesses to any unusual activities. And the delay in discovering the bodies meant that valuable evidence had been lost. Nevertheless, a thorough investigation was conducted. Police brought in tracker dogs, questioned over 100 witnesses, and considered numerous suspects. The heads of the victims were sent to Munich for analysis by clairvoyants, an unconventional investigative method that yielded no results. In 1923, the bodies of the victims were decapitated and their skulls sent to court physicians in order to better study them. One of the first suspects was Victoria's missing husband, Carl Gabriel, who had been declared dead in World War I. Some theorized that Carl might have actually survived the war and returned to find his wife potentially engaged in an incestuous relationship with her father, triggering a vengeful rampage. This theory was largely debunked when Carl's military records were checked, confirming his death in the French trenches in 1914. That suspicion also fell on neighbors with whom Andreas Gruber had quarreled. The farmer was known to have had disputes over property boundaries, and his difficult personality had earned him enemies. One neighbor in particular had previously threatened Andreas with a mattock during an argument, the same type of weapon used in the murders. However, investigations into these leads ultimately led nowhere. The possibility of robbery as a motive was also considered, but seemed unlikely. While some cash was reportedly missing from the house, valuables had been left untouched, and the killer had spent days at the property without making any effort to steal the farm's livestock or equipment. If theft was the motive, why would the perpetrator linger at the scene? Another theory centered on escaped mental patients or vagrants, possibly former soldiers traumatized by the war who might have been squatting in the Gruber's attic before the murders. This could explain the footsteps Andreas had heard and why someone would remain at the farm afterward. However, no evidence was ever found to support this theory either. The most disturbing aspect of the case for many investigators was not just the brutality of the killings, but the apparent familiarity the killer had with the farm and its residents. The murderer seemed to know the layout of the buildings, the routines of the family, and how to tend to the livestock afterward. This suggested someone with intimate knowledge of Hinterkaifeck and its inhabitants, perhaps even someone known and trusted by the family. As the investigation continued without a breakthrough, public fascination with the case grew. The bizarre circumstances of the murders, the isolation of the farmstead, and the unsettling detail of the killer living with the corpses captured the imagination of people far beyond rural Bavaria. Newspapers published lurid accounts of the crime, often embellishing details or speculating wildly about motives and suspects. By 1925, with no resolution in sight, the farm buildings at Hinterkaifeck were dismantled, partly out of practical considerations, as no one wanted to live there, but also to discourage the growing number of curiosity seekers visiting the site. The murder weapons were never definitively identified, and physical evidence that might have solved the case using modern forensic techniques was lost or destroyed. Over the decades, the case was reopened several times as new leads emerged or as advances in investigative techniques offered fresh hope. In 1971, nearly 50 years after the murders, the First and Fellbrook Police Academy re-examined the case using modern criminal investigative methods. While they developed a theory about a specific suspect, this person was never publicly named out of consideration for their living relatives. The case officially remains unsolved. In 2007, students at the Bavarian Police Academy once again reopened the investigation as a cold case exercise. Using modern profiling techniques and forensic analysis, they examined the evidence and concluded that the most likely suspect was a former suitor of Victoria's who had been rejected by her father. However, this remains only a theory, as no conclusive evidence exists to positively identify the killer. The Hinterkaifeck murders exemplify what makes certain historical crimes so endlessly fascinating. The perfect storm of gruesome violence, strange circumstances, and unsolved mystery. But beyond the macabre details that have turned the case into a true crime legend, the murders offer a window into the social and historical context of post-World War I Germany. The early 1920s in Germany were a time of profound social upheaval. The country had been devastated by its defeat in World War I, and the harsh conditions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles had created economic hardship and political instability. Rural areas like Bavaria maintained stronger ties to traditional ways of life, but even there, the trauma of the war and its aftermath was felt. Many men returned from combat psychologically damaged, and the social fabric of communities was altered by the loss of so many young men. Against this backdrop, the isolation of the Gruber family takes on additional significance. Their reclusiveness, the rumors surrounding Andreas and Victoria, and the general atmosphere of suspicion and gossip speak to the complex social dynamics of rural communities during this period. The fact that Andreas did not report the strange occurrences before the murders to police might reflect a widespread distrust of authorities in the aftermath of Germany's defeat and the establishment of the Weimar Republic. The Hinterkaifeck case has left an indelible mark on German popular culture. It has inspired numerous books, articles, and documentaries. In 2009, a film titled Hinterkaifeck, Kaifeck Murder, was released, bringing the story to a new generation. The case is often taught in German police academies as an example of how not to conduct a murder investigation and as an exercise in cold case analysis. A memorial stone now marks the site where the farmstead once stood, surrounded by peaceful fields that give little indication of the horror that occurred there. Visitors still come to pay their respects and to contemplate the mystery that has remained unsolved for over a century. What makes the Hinterkaifeck murders particularly unsettling is not just the brutality of the killings or the mystery of the perpetrator's identity, but the insight they provide into the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of ordinary life. The Gruber family, despite their peculiarities and the rumors that surrounded them, were in many ways typical farmers of their time and place. Their violent end serves as a reminder of the vulnerability of human existence, especially in isolated communities where help might be too far away when danger arrives. The image of the killer living among the dead, maintaining the farm as if nothing had happened, feeding the livestock and tending the fire, represents a level of psychological disturbance that continues to chill even the most seasoned true crime enthusiasts. It suggests a perpetrator who was not merely homicidal, but possessed of a disturbing detachment from normal human emotion. Someone capable of carrying out daily routines in the presence of his victims' corpses. This element of the case points to another reason for its enduring fascination. The Hinterkaifeck murders occurred at a time when the modern understanding of serial killers and psychopathology was in its infancy. Today, behavioral analysts might recognize patterns in the crime that could help identify the type of person responsible. But in 1922, such expertise simply didn't exist. The killer at Hinterkaifeck, whoever they were, operated in a world not yet equipped to understand or capture them. As time passes and the last people with any direct connection to the case have died, the likelihood of ever solving the Hinterkaifeck murders diminishes to near impossibility. The physical evidence is gone, potential witnesses have passed away, and even the farm itself no longer exists. What remains is the story, a dark tale from rural Bavaria that continues to be told and retold, analyzed and debated by each new generation that discovers it. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the Hinterkaifeck case is the questions it forces us to confront about human nature, about evil, and about justice. How could someone commit such a crime and then live among their victims? What drives a person to such extreme violence? And how do we come to terms with the fact that some mysteries may never be solved, some questions never answered? In the end, the Hinterkaifeck murders stand as a testament to the limits of human understanding. Despite all our advances in forensic science, criminal psychology, and investigative techniques, some crimes remain beyond our ability to fully comprehend or resolve. The shadows that fell over that remote Bavarian farmstead in the spring of 1922 have never fully lifted, and perhaps they never will. Today, a century after the murders, the name Hinterkaifeck still evokes a shudder among those familiar with the case. It reminds us that true horror doesn't require supernatural elements. The actions of a human killer, methodically destroying a family and then calmly living among their remains, surpass anything a ghost story could conjure. And perhaps that is why the case continues to haunt us, because somewhere the killer of Hinterkaifeck may have lived out their days in freedom, carrying the secret of those 6 deaths to their own grave, leaving us forever to wonder who they were and why they did what they did on that spring night in 1922. On the frigid night of December 28, 1956, 2 teenage sisters left their home on the southwest side of Chicago to see a movie featuring their idol, Elvis Presley. Their brief journey to the Brighton Theater would mark the beginning of one of Chicago's most haunting unsolved mysteries, a case that would terrify parents, mobilize one of the largest missing persons investigations in the city's history, and ultimately shatter the post-war illusion of safety that had settled over America's growing suburbs. Barbara and Patricia Grimes were, in many ways, typical teenagers of the 1950s. Barbara, 15, and Patricia, 13, lived with their divorced mother, Loretta Grimes, and their 3 siblings in a modest home at 3634 South Damon Avenue in the Brighton Park neighborhood of Chicago. Like millions of American teenagers, they were devoted fans of Elvis Presley, the charismatic young singer who had exploded into popular culture that year. The sisters had already seen Presley's latest movie, Love Me Tender, more than a dozen times, carefully saving their allowances and babysitting money to fund their repeated viewings. December 28th was a cold Thursday night with temperatures hovering around 20 degrees Fahrenheit when Barbara and Patricia set out for what should have been a routine outing. Their mother gave them permission to attend the show one more time, giving them enough money for the bus fare and movie tickets. The girls left home around 7:30 p.m., dressed warmly against the Chicago winter. Barbara in a black and white checked coat, Patricia in a tan coat with a fur collar. The Brighton Theater was less than 2 miles from their home, a straight shot down Archer Avenue. The girls were familiar with the route, having made the trip numerous times before. The movie was scheduled to end at 11 p.m., and the sisters were expected home by midnight at the latest. Their mother wasn't particularly worried when they hadn't returned by that time. Teenagers often ran a bit late, and perhaps they had stopped for a soda at one of the diners along Archer Avenue. But as the night wore on and 1 a.m. came with no sign of the girls, Loretta Grimes grew increasingly concerned. By morning, with her daughter's beds still empty, her concern had turned to panic. She called the police to report Barbara and Patricia missing. Initially, the police were not overly alarmed. Teenage girls often ran away from home, they suggested, especially after the holidays when family tensions could run high. Perhaps the Grimes sisters had decided to follow their musical idol. Elvis Presley was scheduled to appear on a television show in New York on January 6, that Loretta Grimes rejected this theory vehemently. Her daughters were not troubled teenagers, she insisted. They were good students who maintained curfew and always let their mother know where they were going. They would never run away, especially without taking any clothes or personal belongings. Despite her pleas, the police classification remained missing persons, and the initial investigation proceeded without great urgency. What no one could have known then was that the Grimes sisters had already become part of a grim statistic. They had joined the ranks of Chicago's murder victims. But it would be nearly a month before their bodies were discovered. A month of frantic searching, false sightings, cruel hoaxes, and growing desperation. As days passed without word from the girls, the case began to attract more attention. The Chicago Police Department expanded their efforts, and the FBI joined the investigation. Photographs of Barbara and Patricia appeared in newspapers and on television. Dozens of detectives were assigned to follow up on reported sightings of the sisters, which began pouring in from across the country. Point one, particularly cruel hoax involved a phone call to the Grimes home from someone claiming to be holding the girls captive. The caller instructed Loretta to go to a specific location with ransom money. Police staked out the area, but no one appeared. Other reports placed the sisters in Tennessee, in Nashville, in Florida, everywhere, it seemed, except where they actually were. The case took a dramatic turn when Elvis Presley himself, informed of the sisters' disappearance and their devotion to him, issued a personal plea. "If you're good Presley fans, you'll go home and ease your mother's worries," he said, addressing the girls directly through the media. His intervention brought national attention to the case and led to even more reported sightings, none of which panned out. The last confirmed sighting of Barbara and Patricia had been at the Brighton Theater. Several witnesses, including the girls' friend Dorothy Weiner, confirmed seeing them at the 7:30 p.m. showing of Love Me Tender. After that, the trail went cold. Some reports suggested the sisters had been seen at a bus stop near the theater after the movie, while others placed them at a nearby restaurant. None of these later sightings could be definitively confirmed. The uncertainty surrounding their disappearance fed growing public anxiety. In the relatively innocent era of the 1950s, the idea of two teenage girls vanishing while on a simple trip to the movies struck at the heart of parents' fears. The case dominated Chicago newspapers and was featured prominently in national media. As January wore on with no resolution, hope began to fade that the Grimes sisters would be found alive on January 22nd, 1956, exactly 25 days after Barbara and Patricia disappeared. The grim discovery that everyone had been dreading finally came. Leonard Prescott, a construction worker, was driving along German Church Road near Willow Springs, a rural area southwest of Chicago. Looking down an embankment beside the road, he spotted what appeared to be two naked bodies lying in a small ditch. Prescott immediately contacted the Cook County Sheriff's Police. The bodies were quickly identified as those of Barbara and Patricia Grimes. They lay side by side, Barbara's arm draped protectively over her younger sister. They were nude, their clothes nowhere to be found. Their bodies were partially frozen and showed signs of having been exposed to the elements for some time. The discovery site was only about 12 miles from their home, in a sparsely populated area known as Devil's Creek. The autopsy findings were inconclusive and would become a source of controversy that hampered the investigation. The Cook County coroner, Walter McCarran, initially determined that the girls had died just hours before their bodies were found, based on the lack of decomposition. This assessment was quickly challenged by the pathologist who performed the autopsy, Dr. Jerry Kearns, who concluded that the sisters had died shortly after their disappearance, their bodies preserved by the freezing temperatures. Further complicating matters was the question of cause of death. No bullet wounds or stabbing injuries were present. There were some bruises and scratches, but nothing that clearly indicated violence. Toxicology tests found no drugs or poisons. Dr. Kearns eventually listed the official cause of death as shock and exposure to the low temperatures, but he couldn't rule out the possibility that the girls had been held captive indoors for some time before being killed and dumped at the site. The investigation now shifted from a missing persons case to a murder investigation. Police faced enormous pressure to solve the crime that had horrified Chicago and the nation. They pursued multiple avenues, questioning known sex offenders in the area, interviewing dozens of the girls' friends and classmates, and following up on hundreds of tips from the public. Point one of the first significant suspects was Edward Benny Bedwell, a 21-year-old drifter who worked as a dishwasher. Bedwell became a person of interest after acquaintances claimed to have seen him with two girls matching the Grimes sisters' descriptions at a restaurant on January 7th, nearly 2 weeks after their disappearance. Under intense questioning, Bedwell signed a confession stating that he and a friend named Frank had picked up the girls, taken them to various bars and restaurants, and then beaten them to death when they refused sexual advances. The Bedwell's confession seemed to provide the resolution everyone had been seeking, but it quickly fell apart. Medical evidence contradicted his timeline, and Bedwell himself recanted, claiming the police had coerced him into confessing. His alleged accomplice, Frank, could not be located, and witnesses who initially placed Bedwell with the girls later admitted they were mistaken. Charges against Bedwell were eventually dropped, leaving investigators back at square one. That another person of interest was a local teenager who reportedly had a crush on Barbara Grimes and was allegedly seen arguing with her shortly before the disappearance. However, this lead also failed to produce sufficient evidence for an arrest. The investigation explored multiple theories about what had happened to the Grimes sisters. Could they have been victims of a serial killer? The 1950s had seen the emergence of the highway killer phenomenon, as America's expanding road system created new opportunities for predators to find victims and quickly escape. Could they have been abducted by someone they knew, perhaps even someone from their neighborhood? Or had they willingly gotten into a car with someone who offered them a ride on that cold December night, never suspecting the danger? As months passed without an arrest, the case gradually receded from the headlines, though it remained active in the files of the Chicago Police Department. For the Grimes family, particularly Loretta Grimes, the lack of closure was devastating. She never accepted that her daughters might have engaged in risky behavior or willingly gone with strangers. "My girls were good girls," she insisted repeatedly. "Someone took them." Loretta Grimes died in July 1989 without ever knowing who had killed her daughters or why. In her final years, she continued to attend church services daily, praying for justice that never came during her lifetime. The murder of Barbara and Patricia Grimes left an indelible mark on Chicago. For many residents who lived through that winter of 1956 to 57, the case represented the end of innocence, a stark reminder that even the prosperous, seemingly safe environment of post-war America, terrible things could happen to ordinary people going about their everyday lives. Parents became more protective of their children, more suspicious of strangers, more aware of the potential dangers lurking in their communities. The case also highlighted the limitations of forensic science in the 1950s. Today, DNA analysis, advanced toxicology tests, and sophisticated crime scene processing might have yielded critical evidence that was missed or undetectable using the methods available then. The investigation was further hampered by jurisdictional issues, with multiple police agencies involved and sometimes working at cross purposes. Over the decades, the Grimes sisters' murder case has been periodically reopened and reviewed as new investigative techniques developed. Cold case detectives have re-examined the evidence, re-interviewed surviving witnesses, and followed up on tips that continue to trickle in even decades later. In the 1990s, investigators looked into possible connections between the Grimes case and other unsolved murders from the same era, including the 1955 killing of 3 boys in Chicago's Robinson Woods. But no definitive links were established. One persistent theory involves a man named Charles Leroy Melquist, who was convicted of murdering a 15-year-old girl named Bonnie Lee Scott in 1958. Some investigators have suggested similarities between the Scott murder and the Grimes case, but Melquist, who died in prison in 2010, was never charged in connection with the sisters' deaths. Another potential suspect who emerged in later years was a man named Ray Brennan, who had worked as a police officer and later became a newspaper reporter who covered the Grimes case extensively. Some investigators found his intense interest in the case suspicious, and there were reports that he had inserted himself into the investigation in unusual ways. However, Brennan died in 1983, and no conclusive evidence has ever linked him to the murders. The Grimes sisters' case remains officially unsolved more than 6 decades later. The passage of time has made it increasingly unlikely that their killer will ever be identified with certainty. Most of the original investigators Witnesses and suspects are now deceased. Physical evidence has been lost or degraded. The landscape of Devil's Creek, where their bodies were found, has been transformed by development. Yet the case continues to haunt Chicago's collective memory. Books, articles, and documentaries have revisited the mystery, each offering its own theories and insights. The murders have become part of the city's dark folklore, a cautionary tale passed down through generations. Each retelling emphasizes different aspects of the story: the innocence of the victims, the panic of the search, the frustration of the investigation, the devastating impact on the family and community. For true crime historians, the Grimes case represents a pivotal moment in American crime awareness. It occurred at a time when the post-war optimism of the 1950s was beginning to give way to the social upheavals of the 1960s. The media coverage of the disappearance and murder investigation demonstrated the growing power of television news and its ability to turn local tragedies into national concerns. The case also foreshadowed the development of Amber Alerts, missing children organizations, and the infrastructure of rapid response to child disappearances that would develop in later decades. Perhaps what makes the Grimes sister story particularly poignant is how ordinary it began. Two teenage girls, excited about seeing their favorite movie star on screen, set out on a simple journey they had made many times before. They never returned home, their lives cut tragically short for reasons we may never fully understand. Their names, Barbara and Patricia Grimes, have become synonymous in Chicago with innocence lost, with the fragility of safety, with the terrible randomness of violence. Today, the Brighton Theater where the girls saw Love Me Tender on that fateful night is long gone, demolished years ago. The neighborhood where they lived has changed dramatically. Even Devil's Creek, where their bodies were found, bears little resemblance to the isolated spot it was in 1957. But the mystery remains, unsolved and as haunting as ever. A dark chapter in Chicago's history that refuses to be closed. Each year, as the anniversary of their disappearance passes, someone usually leaves flowers at the sisters' grave in Holy Sepulchre Cemetery. Their headstone reads, "Loving daughters, Barbara and Patricia Grimes." Below their names is a simple inscription that echoes the unfulfilled promise of their young lives. "Sister, sleep in peace until we meet again." The Grimes sisters would be in their late 70s and early 80s today had they lived. Instead, they remain forever teenagers, frozen in time like the black and white photographs that appeared in newspapers across the country during that anxious month of searching. Their story serves as a reminder that behind every sensational headline, every unsolved mystery, are real lives cut short and families left to wonder why. For Chicago and for America, Barbara and Patricia Grimes represent not just a notorious cold case, but a loss of innocence that can never be recovered. On a crisp September morning in 1922, beneath the spreading branches of a crabapple tree on an abandoned farm in Somerset County, New Jersey, a shocking discovery would launch one of the most sensational murder investigations of the early 20th century. The bodies of a respected Episcopal minister and a choir singer from his church lay side by side on the ground, carefully arranged, with torn love letters scattered around them like macabre confetti. The discovery marked the beginning of what would become known as the Hall Mills murder case, a scandal that combined forbidden romance, class divisions, and brutal violence into a story that captivated America. Edward Wheeler Hall was, by all outward appearances, a model citizen of New Brunswick, New Jersey. At 41 years old, he served as the rector of the fashionable St. John the Evangelist Episcopal Church, where he ministered to some of the city's most prominent families. He had married Frances Stevens, the daughter of one of New Brunswick's wealthiest families. Frances brought to the marriage not only substantial wealth, but also her two brothers, Willie and Henry Stevens, and her eccentric mother, known to locals as the pig woman for the hog she raised. Edward and Frances lived in a handsome home on Nickel Avenue, where they entertained the social elite of New Brunswick. But Edward Hall harbored a secret that would eventually cost him his life. For several years, he had been engaged in an affair with Eleanor Mills, a 34-year-old member of his church choir. Eleanor was married to James Mills, the church sexton who rang the bells and maintained the grounds. Unlike the wealthy Halls, the Mills family lived modestly on Carmen Street, in a neighborhood where factory workers and other working-class families made their homes. Eleanor had 2 children and worked part-time as a seamstress to supplement her husband's meager income. The affair between Reverend Hall and Eleanor Mills was perhaps the worst-kept secret in New Brunswick. Choir members had noticed their lingering glances and hushed conversations. The two were frequently seen walking together or meeting in a local park. They exchanged passionate love letters, with Eleanor signing hers as Charlotte, perhaps in a naive attempt at discretion. In these letters, they poured out their feelings for each other and their frustrations with their respective marriages. Hall described his wife as cold and unloving, while Eleanor complained about her husband's drinking and neglect. By September 1922, rumors suggest that Edward had made a momentous decision. Some accounts claim he had resolved to leave his wealthy wife and abandon his prestigious position to run away with Eleanor. Whether this was truly his intention will never be known with certainty. What is known is that on the evening of September 14th, 1922, both Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills left their homes, never to return alive. The discovery of their bodies came on the morning of September 16th, when Raymond Schneider, a 23-year-old factory worker, and his girlfriend were taking a romantic stroll along De Russey's Lane, a lover's lane on the outskirts of New Brunswick. What they found was a carefully arranged tableau of death. The bodies of Hall and Mills lay side by side, their feet pointing toward the crabapple tree, their hands folded across their chests. Hall's calling card had been placed at his feet. Scattered around and between the bodies were the torn fragments of their love letters, as if someone had wanted to expose their secret relationship even in death. The murder itself had been carried out with brutal efficiency. Edward Hall had been shot once in the head, the bullet entering his right temple. Eleanor Mills had suffered a far more violent death. She had been shot 3 times in the head, and her throat had been cut so savagely that she was nearly decapitated. Most disturbing of all, her tongue and vocal cords, the instruments of her singing in the church choir, had been cut out. The initial investigation was plagued by incompetence and possibly corruption. The crime scene was not properly secured, allowing curious onlookers to trample potential evidence. Souvenir hunters took pieces of the lovers, clothing, and fragments of the scattered letters. Some reports even claim that a carnival-like atmosphere developed, with vendors selling hot dogs and drinks to the crowd that gathered. By the time professional investigators arrived from the prosecutor's office, much of the physical evidence had been compromised or removed entirely. The autopsies revealed that Hall and Mills had likely been killed elsewhere and their bodies transported to the scene beneath the crabapple tree. Despite the violence of the murders, particularly Eleanor's, there was surprisingly little blood at the scene. The precise time of death could not be determined with certainty, but it appeared they had been killed on the night of September 14th, shortly after they left their homes. Suspicion quickly fell on the obvious suspects, the betrayed spouses. James Mills, Eleanor's husband, was interrogated multiple times. He claimed to have been at home on the night of the murders, a claim supported by his daughter Charlotte. Frances Hall, Edward's wealthy wife, also denied any involvement. She stated that when Edward didn't return home that night, she assumed he had been called away to attend to church business. But the most scrutinized suspects were Frances Hall's brothers, Henry and Willie Stevens, and their mother, the eccentric Mrs. Stevens. The Stevens family had both motive and means. They were fiercely protective of their family name and had reportedly been distressed by the rumors surrounding Edward's affair. They also had access to firearms and enough influence in the community to potentially influence the investigation that a breakthrough in the case seemed to come when a witness named Jane Gibson came forward. Known locally as the Pig Woman because she raised hogs on her small farm near the murder scene, Gibson claimed to have witnessed the murders while riding her mule, Jenny, in pursuit of someone she thought was stealing corn from her field. She identified Henry Stevens as the shooter and claimed to have seen Frances Hall and another person at the scene as well. Despite Jane Gibson's testimony, the initial investigation ended without charges being filed against anyone. Many in New Brunswick whispered that the wealth and influence of the Stevens family had derailed the investigation. The case might have ended there, relegated to the status of an unsolved mystery, if not for the persistence of the press. The Hall Mills case had all the elements that newspaper editors dream of: sex, violence, religion, and class conflict. The New York Daily Mirror, a tabloid owned by William Randolph Hearst, took a particular interest in the case. In 1926, for years after the murders, the Daily Mirror began publishing a series of articles suggesting that the case had been deliberately buried to protect the wealthy and powerful. The public outcry that followed forced authorities to reopen the investigation. This time, charges were filed against Frances Hall and her brothers, Henry and Willie Stevens, along with their cousin Henry Carpenter. They were accused of conspiracy to commit murder. The trial that followed would become one of the most sensational of the decade. The trial began in November 1926 in Somerville, New Jersey. Crowds lined up outside the courthouse each day, hoping to get a seat in the packed courtroom. The proceedings were covered by more than 300 reporters from across the country, including the famous journalist Damon Runyon. The case dominated newspaper headlines for weeks. The prosecution's case hinged largely on the testimony of Jane Gibson, the pig woman, who was by then seriously ill with cancer. In a dramatic courtroom scene, she was brought to court on a hospital stretcher to give her testimony. However, under cross-examination by the defense's skilled attorneys, her account began to show inconsistencies. She changed details about the time of night, what she had seen, and even which direction she had been traveling on her mule. Other witnesses also presented problems for the prosecution. A man named Arthur Reel testified that he had seen the Stevens brothers near the murder scene on the night of the killings, but he too proved unreliable under cross-examination. The prosecution's case was further weakened when expert witnesses questioned whether Eleanor Mills's tongue and vocal cords had actually been removed, suggesting instead that the damage might have been caused by decomposition or animals. The defense, meanwhile, presented alibis for all the accused. They called witnesses who testified that Frances Hall had been at home on the night of the murders, while her brothers claimed to have been playing cards at their club. The defense also suggested alternative suspects, including James Mills, Eleanor's husband, who they argued had a more immediate motive for the killings. Throughout the trial, Frances Hall maintained a stoic demeanor that newspapers described variously as dignified, cold, or imperious, depending on her sympathies. Willie Stevens, described as simple or intellectually disabled by some accounts, seemed confused by the proceedings. Henry Stevens, portrayed as the family enforcer, remained impassive. After 3 weeks of testimony and less than 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: not guilty on all counts. Whether justice was served or thwarted by this verdict remains a subject of debate to this day. In the aftermath of the trial, the principals in the drama faded back into private life. Frances Hall continued to live in the house she had shared with Edward, maintaining her social position in New Brunswick until her death in 1942. She never remarried. Henry and Willie Stevens also lived out their lives in New Brunswick, protected by their family wealth from any lasting social consequences of the scandal. James Mills, Eleanor's widower, moved away from New Brunswick shortly after the trial and disappeared from public view. The Hall Mills case, though it ended without a conviction, had a lasting impact on American culture and jurisprudence. It was one of the first trials to receive wall-to-wall media coverage, setting a pattern that would be followed in later sensational cases. The extensive press coverage raised questions about whether defendants could receive a fair trial in the face of media-driven public opinion. It also highlighted the role that wealth and social standing could play in the justice system. The case exposed the class divisions that existed in American society in the 1920s. Had Edward Hall been a factory worker rather than a minister from a wealthy family, or had the victims been found in a poor neighborhood rather than on a lover's lane, the case likely would have received far less attention. The stark contrast between the wealthy, influential Stevens family and the working-class Mills family underscored the economic inequality of the era. The Hall Mills murder also reflected the changing sexual mores of the 1920s. The decade was a time of social transformation, when Victorian restraint was giving way to the more liberated attitudes of the Jazz Age. The very public exposure of Reverend Hall's infidelity, through the reading of the love letters in court and their reproduction in newspapers, brought conversations about adultery and sexual desire into American living rooms in an unprecedented way. For New Brunswick, the murders and the subsequent trial were a trauma from which the community took years to recover. St. John the Evangelist Church, where Edward Hall had preached and Eleanor Mills had sung, struggled to rebuild its reputation. The crabapple tree where the bodies were found became a macabre tourist attraction until it was finally cut down to discourage visitors. Over the decades, the Hall Mills case has continued to fascinate both true crime enthusiasts and scholars. Numerous books have been written about the murders, each offering its own theory about who really killed Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills. Some point to Frances Hall and her brothers as the most likely culprits, despite their acquittal. Others suggest that James Mills might have committed the murders in a rage over his wife's infidelity. Still others propose more exotic theories involving political conspiracies or religious vendettas. Perhaps the most compelling modern analysis comes from William Kunstler, the famous civil rights attorney, who examined the case in his 1964 book, The Minister and the Choir Singer. Kunstler concluded that the most likely scenario involved Frances Hall discovering her husband's plans to leave her for Eleanor Mills. According to Kunstler's theory, Frances confronted the couple and then called her brothers for help, leading to the fatal confrontation. But the truth is that we will never know with certainty who killed Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills on that September night in 1922. Too much time has passed, too much evidence was lost or contaminated, and too many witnesses gave conflicting or unreliable testimony. The case remains officially unsolved. What endures is the story itself. The tragic tale of a minister and a choir singer whose forbidden love led them to a violent end beneath a crabapple tree. Their carefully arranged bodies, the scattered love letters, the cut throat and missing tongue, the wealthy widow and her eccentric family, the woman on the mule who claimed to have witnessed the murders. These elements combine to create a narrative that continues to resonate a century later. The Hall Mills case reminds us that the past was not simpler or more innocent than our present. Behind the formal facades of 1920s respectability lay the same human passions, jealousies, and capacity for violence that we recognize today. It also demonstrates how wealth and social standing could influence the course of justice, a reality that continues to challenge our legal system. Perhaps most poignantly, the case speaks to the destructive power of forbidden love and the dangerous consequences of living a double life. Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills sought happiness together despite their marital vows and the social conventions of their time. Whether they were killed by vengeful spouses, outraged family members, or someone else entirely, it was their illicit relationship that ultimately placed them beneath that crabapple tree, side by side in death, as they had longed to be in life. Today, on the quiet streets of New Brunswick, few visible reminders of the Hall Mills case remain. St. John the Evangelist Church still stands, though it has been merged with another parish. The Hall House on Nickel Avenue and the Mills House on Carmen Street have long since changed hands. The crabapple tree is gone, and Russey's Lane has been absorbed by suburban development. But in the archives of newspapers, in true crime literature, in the collective memory of American culture, the story of the minister and the choir singer lives on. A dark romance from the jazz age that ended in blood beneath a tree on a lover's lane.
Today, we're traveling to the outskirts of Chicago to investigate one of America's most enduring ghost stories, a tale with roots in real tragedy. This is the story of Resurrection Mary, the phantom hitchhiker who's been walking the roads near Resurrection Cemetery for nearly a century. But unlike many ghost stories, this one has hundreds of credible witnesses, police reports, and physical evidence. So join me as we separate truth from fiction in the case of Chicago's most famous specter. It always begins the same way. A young woman in a white dress, thumbing for a ride along Archer Avenue in the dead of night. Her blonde hair catches the moonlight. Her skin is pale, almost translucent. She's beautiful but distant, her eyes reflecting something beyond the here and now. The drivers who stop say she's polite but quiet. She gives an address in Chicago, but never makes it home. Instead, as the car approaches Resurrection Cemetery, she asks to be let out. Some say she simply vanishes from the passenger seat. Others claim they watch her walk toward the cemetery gates before disappearing into thin air. And then, there are those who say she never asked to be let out at all. They simply felt their car grow ice cold as they passed the cemetery, only to find their passenger gone when they turned to look. This is the legend of Resurrection Mary. But like all legends, it began with something real. Resurrection Cemetery in Justice, Illinois, just southwest of Chicago, is home to more than 150,000 graves. Among them lies a young woman whose tragic death in the 1930s may have spawned decades of ghostly encounters. The most widely accepted origin story centers on a young woman named Mary Bregovy, who died in a car accident in 1934. But historical research has revealed several other candidates, including Anna Norquist, who died in a 1927 car accident on her way home from the O. Henry Ballroom, a popular dance hall now known as Willowbrook Ballroom. Another theory points to Mary Muskowski, killed in a hit-and-run on Archer Avenue in 1930 after leaving a dance. And yet another candidate is Marie Beloix, who died in 1921, but was known to frequent the dance halls along Archer Avenue. What these women share is youth, tragic deaths, connections to local dance halls, and graves in Resurrection Cemetery. But which one, if any, became the ghostly figure known as Resurrection Mary? The earliest documented sighting of Resurrection Mary dates to 1939, when Jerry Paulus, a young man from Chicago's South Side, met a beautiful blonde woman at the Liberty Grove and Hall Ballroom. They danced all evening, and Jerry offered her a ride home. "She was the most beautiful girl I'd ever seen," Paulus would later recount. "But her skin was ice cold when I touched her hand." As they drove down Archer Avenue, the woman asked Jerry to stop in front of Resurrection Cemetery. She said, "This is where I have to get out," and walked toward the gates. Jerry watched, confused, as she approached the locked cemetery gates and then simply vanished before his eyes. The next day, still shaken, Jerry went to the address she had given him earlier in the evening. There, a woman informed him that her daughter, who matched the description of his dance partner, had died years earlier and was buried in Resurrection Cemetery. This established the pattern that would repeat for decades. A young woman met at a dance hall or spotted hitchhiking, always heading toward the cemetery, always vanishing. Throughout the 1940s and 50s, reports of the ghostly hitchhiker multiplied. Cab drivers, police officers, and everyday commuters all shared similar stories. Mary would appear along Archer Avenue, especially in the cold winter months, usually between the O. Henry Ballroom and Resurrection Cemetery. One of the most compelling accounts comes from a cab driver named Ralph. In 1941, he picked up a young woman near the ballroom. She wore a white party dress despite the bitter January cold. She directed him to head north on Archer, but as they passed the cemetery gates, she suddenly became agitated. She opened the back door and ran toward the cemetery. Ralph reported to his dispatcher. "I thought she was trying to skip on the fare, so I called it in right away." Police arrived to find Ralph visibly shaken. There were no footprints in the fresh snow leading from the road to the cemetery. The gates were locked, the snow undisturbed. This was the first time Mary's appearance was officially documented in police records, giving the legend a level of credibility unusual for ghost stories. If Resurrection Mary were merely a series of similar ghost sightings, it might have faded into local folklore. But in 1976, an incident occurred that transformed the legend into something more tangible. On August 10, 1976, a passing motorist noticed something strange at Resurrection Cemetery. There were what appeared to be handprints burned into the iron bars of the front gates. The metal was bent and twisted, as if someone had gripped the bars with incredible force. The cemetery management, embarrassed by the attention, quickly had the bars cut out and replaced. But before they could act, multiple photographs were taken of the damaged bars. The images show what appear to be small handprints seared into the metal, with the bars themselves bent outward, as if someone had tried to escape the cemetery grounds. Metallurgical analysis conducted by investigators showed that the marks would have required temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, temperatures that would have incinerated human flesh. The official explanation from cemetery officials was that the marks were caused by cemetery equipment that had accidentally backed into the gates. Few were convinced by this explanation, particularly given the clear shape of small handprints visible in photographs. While the most dramatic sightings occurred in the mid-20th century, encounters with Resurrection Mary have continued into recent decades. In October 1989, Janet Calloway was driving past the cemetery when she had to swerve to avoid hitting a young woman who darted into the road. She was wearing this old-fashioned white dress, Calloway reported to local newspapers. When my headlights hit her, she didn't reflect light like a normal person. She almost absorbed it. Calloway stopped her car and looked back, but the figure had vanished. What makes this sighting particularly interesting is that Calloway had never heard the Resurrection Mary legend before her encounter. In 1991, a Chicago police officer reported seeing a young woman inside the closed cemetery near dawn. Thinking she might be a mourner who had been accidentally locked in overnight, he called for cemetery officials to check the grounds. A search revealed no one, and all gates remained locked from the inside. Perhaps most compelling are the clusters of independent sightings that occur simultaneously. On the night of March 10, 1995, during a late winter storm, 3 separate drivers reported picking up a young woman in a white dress along Archer Avenue, only to have her vanish from their vehicles near the cemetery. None of the drivers knew each other, and all made their reports within a 2-hour period. What makes the Resurrection Mary case so fascinating to researchers isn't just the quantity of sightings, but their consistency over decades. Dr. Eleanor Suarez, a folklorist who has studied the phenomenon since the 1980s, notes, "Unlike many urban legends that evolve dramatically over time, the Resurrection Mary encounters have remained remarkably consistent for over 80 years. This consistency suggests either a genuine paranormal phenomenon or a deeply embedded cultural script that witnesses unconsciously follow when interpreting ambiguous experiences." Chicago historian Richard Crowe, who documented Mary's sightings for over 30 years, believed the ghost story persists because it resonates with universal fears. The phantom hitchhiker represents the sudden, unexpected nature of death, particularly deaths on roadways. Mary is forever trying to get home, but never making it. It's worth noting that the Resurrection Mary legend emerged during a period of rapidly increasing automobile usage and, consequently, rising traffic fatalities. The specter of the beautiful young woman killed in her prime encapsulated societal anxieties about the deadly potential of new technology. Resurrection Mary isn't the only phantom hitchhiker in American folklore, though she may be the most famous. Similar legends exist across the country. In North Carolina, the Phantom Hitchhiker of Jamestown has been reported since the 1920s. In Pennsylvania, the White Lady of Wapsie haunts a mountain road near Altoona. And California has its own Charman, a burn ghost who appears on Ojai Road. What distinguishes Mary is the specificity of her haunting location and the documentation of sightings. While most phantom hitchhiker stories are told as friend-of-a-friend tales, Mary's appearances have been recorded in police reports, newspaper articles, and first-hand testimonies. Dr. James Huron, a research psychologist who specializes in paranormal beliefs, notes, "Most ghost stories lack credible witnesses. With Resurrection Mary, we have police officers, taxi drivers, and other reliable observers who had no obvious reason to fabricate their experiences." Over the decades, numerous paranormal investigators have attempted to document Mary's appearances. Equipment ranging from early film cameras to modern thermal imaging has been deployed along Archer Avenue. In 1989, a team from the Illinois Paranormal Research Society conducted a year-long study, interviewing witnesses and monitoring the cemetery perimeter. While they captured no definitive evidence of Mary's existence, they did record unusual temperature fluctuations near the cemetery gates that couldn't be explained by environmental factors. More recently, in 2018, investigators using sensitive audio equipment recorded what they described as a woman's voice singing 1930s dance hall music near the cemetery entrance. The recordings, while intriguing, remain inconclusive. What's perhaps most telling is what these investigations haven't found. Despite decades of scrutiny, no investigator has ever debunked a major Resurrection Mary sighting or revealed a hoax behind the phenomenon. Today, Resurrection Mary remains an active legend. The Willowbrook Ballroom, where many believe Mary spent her last evening alive, burned down in 2016, an eerily symbolic end to a location central to her story. Yet sightings continue along Archer Avenue. Is Mary a product of collective imagination, a ghost story that grew from tragedy into legend? Or is there something more to the countless witnesses who've encountered this spectral figure over nearly a century? Perhaps the most compelling aspect of Resurrection Mary isn't the possibility of a genuine haunting, but what the persistence of her story reveals about us. In an age of science and skepticism, we still find room for mystery. We still slow our cars as we pass Resurrection Cemetery on cold nights, half hoping, half fearing we might see a young woman in white, her thumb extended, asking for a ride home she'll never complete. For those near Chicago, Archer Avenue remains open to traffic day and night. Resurrection Cemetery stands, as it has for generations, its iron gates restored after those mysterious handprints were discovered. And somewhere, perhaps between this world and whatever comes next, a young woman named Mary may still be trying to find her way home.
Susan Reinert, affectionately known as Sue, was born in 1943 in the town of Ridgeway in northwestern Pennsylvania. Her father, William Gallagher, worked as a newspaper sales manager, while her mother, Jane Gallagher, was a dedicated teacher. From an early age, Susan showed a passion for learning and a strong love of literature, suggesting that she might follow in her mother's footsteps into the field of education. While studying at Grove City College, Susan met a young Air Force recruit named Kenneth Reinert. Although their meeting was simple, it had a profound impact on her life. Susan and Kenneth's relationship deepened as they both pursued higher education. After much effort and determination, Susan graduated from college with a bachelor's degree. She continued her education, earning a master's degree in English from Pennsylvania State University. In 1965, Susan and Kenneth began their new lives after graduating from Grove City College. Because Kenneth was in the military, they had to move around a lot. They started by moving to Sacramento, California, then returned to the Northeast and lived in Rome, New York. The family even lived in Puerto Rico for a while before settling permanently in the Philadelphia area in 1971. In 1974, Susan Reinert, a devoted teacher and loving mother, experienced a turning point when she and Kenneth decided to divorce. The divorce was amicable, without legal disputes. Susan then became an active single mother, focusing on building a home for her two children, Karen and Michael. With her warm and friendly personality, she was well liked by her colleagues and students at Chestnut Walled Elementary School. In addition to her teaching career, Susan was actively involved with Parents Without Partners, especially in the Valley Forge program. After her mother passed away, Susan found strength and support from this organization despite her grief. Despite many challenges, she persevered. Through her involvement with Parents Without Partners, Susan's story took a mysterious turn. On June 22, 1979, Susan Reinert and her two children spent their day together. That morning, her son Michael had been with his father, Kenneth. That evening, they had attended a father-son baseball game. However, the game ended early when Susan picked Michael up at 8:30 p.m. That evening, Susan contacted her ex-husband's parents, Florence and John Reinert. Despite their divorce, she had maintained a good relationship with them. Susan checked the gas tank and found it was nearly full, enough for the trip to Allentown, Pennsylvania, a town about an hour's drive north. The purpose of the trip was to attend a single-parent conference and spend the weekend with her children. Susan had signed up to run a workshop there and keep the children involved in activities throughout the weekend. They planned to leave on Saturday morning and return home late Sunday at around 9 p.m. on Friday night. Karen and Michael were playing outside, picking up hailstones left over from a summer storm. About 30 minutes later, neighbors heard Susan's orange-red Plymouth Horizon start. Minutes later, the car disappeared. Susan had left the house with her 2 children, possibly to visit her boyfriend before going to the conference. She was in a long-term relationship with William Bradfield, a fellow teacher. Although they tried to keep it a secret, the relationship was causing tension in Susan's marriage to Kenneth. There were even rumors that Susan and William might get married. That on June 22, 1979, Susan and her children set off. After visiting her boyfriend, they planned to travel to Allentown, about 49 miles north, to spend the night at a motel. However, they never arrived. Susan and her children disappeared without a trace, leaving those who knew and loved them distraught. That on June 25, 1979, Susan's Plymouth hatchback was discovered in the parking lot of the Host Inn in Harrisburg, 87 miles from Allentown and 97 miles from her home. Tragically, Susan's lifeless body was found in the back of the car. The details of her agonizing death were gruesome. Her body was naked, beaten, and bound with chains, curled up in the wheel well of the car. Her hands were tied, and she had black eyes. She had been beaten with chains or tied so tightly that the chains left bruises on her back. More frighteningly, she had been injected with a fatal dose of morphine. The whereabouts of her 2 children, however, were unknown. They had seemingly disappeared without a trace. Police searched for hours, but no one had seen them, nor had any of Susan's friends or relatives seen them that weekend. So, the police began investigating further. They posted pictures of the Reinert family in newspapers for weeks, looking for any clues about the children. The investigation discovered that Susan had named William Bradfield, the man she thought she was going to marry, as the beneficiary of $730,000 in life insurance policies. This raised suspicions that her children might have been murdered so he could receive the money. However, William Bradfield had a solid alibi, as he was in Cape May, New Jersey, the weekend Susan was murdered and her children went missing. Several teachers were present and confirmed his whereabouts. The police then turned their attention to Upper Marion High School, where Susan worked. The school was experiencing problems, and Principal Jay Smith was embroiled in a scandal. He had served as principal until he was fired the previous year after being arrested at a local shopping center. In his Ford Granada, police discovered loaded handguns, a balaclava, and burglary tools. More disturbingly, a syringe containing morphine was found in the trunk. Jay had been struggling before that. His wife, Stephanie Smith, was diagnosed with malignant cancer and died in August 1979 after several hospitalizations. During this time, Stephanie Smith began keeping a diary documenting her husband's strange behavior, which became increasingly worse. Jay became involved in intimate groups and changed sexual partners, which Stephanie did not approve of. This seemed to lead to even more disturbing behavior. In September 1977, Stephanie Huntsberger, the adult daughter of the couple, moved in with her parents along with her husband, Edward Huntsberger. They settled into the Smiths' home in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania. That fall, Stephanie Smith was battling cancer, which caused turmoil in the family and seemed to increase tensions among them. Edward and Stephanie Huntsberger, Jay's daughter and son-in-law, were struggling with heroin addiction and had difficulty finding and keeping jobs before deciding to move back in with their families. Moving in with their parents was a desperate attempt to escape drugs. In early 1978, Jay Smith's daughter and son-in-law, Stephanie and Edward Huntsberger, mysteriously disappeared. They had moved in with Jay Smith and his wife just a few months earlier. They were last seen in February 1978, when they visited Edward's parents in North Wales, Pennsylvania. When they left, they promised to return soon, but then they disappeared. Their disappearance was first noticed when Edward failed to show up for a meeting with his probation officer later that month. Authorities contacted Jay Smith, the last person known to have had contact with the couple. Jay Smith told people that Edward and Stephanie Huntsberger had run away to California. He said they owed money to some drug dealers in the area and had fled to the West Coast. However, he was unable to provide any further information about the incident. Edward and Stephanie Huntsberger lived a nomadic life, so their disappearance went unnoticed for some time. Meanwhile, Jay was arrested for burglary. When police searched Jay's home, they found several suspicious items, including weapons, drugs, security uniforms, badges, and pornography. They also discovered nitric acid and office supplies stolen from a nearby school. Jay was suspected of being involved in recent armed robberies. During the burglary trial, Jay's friend William testified that they were on vacation when the robberies occurred. However, the jury did not believe this testimony. Jay had a bad reputation in Upper Merion and was known as the Prince of Darkness. Jay Smith was eventually sentenced to 2 to 5 years in prison on June 25, 1979, for a series of store robberies that took place in the late 1970s. During the investigation, Jay was arrested for burglary. Although he was in custody, the police still considered him a prime suspect in Susan's murder and continued to investigate his past. They made a remarkable discovery. Jay's daughter and son-in-law had also disappeared under similar circumstances as Susan and her 2 children. This led the police to suspect a connection between the 2 disappearances, Susan's death, and the disappearance of her children. First, Susan had been killed by a morphine overdose, and a large amount of morphine had been discovered in Jay's home several months earlier. Second, a plastic cone with Jay's identification had been found in Susan's car. The disappearance of his daughter and son-in-law closely resembled the disappearance of Susan's children. The events that unfolded in this case were shocking and left a lasting impact on the public. However, the most shocking truth was yet to be revealed. In late July 1979, about a month after Susan's body was found near Harrisburg, investigators discovered a potential motive for the horrific murder: financial gain. On July 20th, 1979, a Philadelphia attorney filed a motion to stay the execution of Susan's will in both Montgomery County and Delaware County. The motion was filed on behalf of Kenneth Reinert, Susan's ex-husband, and Patrick Gallagher, her brother. The purpose of this legal action was to give both men an opportunity to review the contents of Susan's will before it was executed. They decided to file in both counties because Susan's residence in Ardmore, Pennsylvania, was near the county line, allowing her to file her will in either jurisdiction. It was later discovered that just a few weeks before her death, Susan had made several significant changes to her will. She had also purchased several large life insurance policies, naming her current boyfriend, William, as the beneficiary. In the legal documents, she referred to him as her future husband. As the police investigated further, they determined that Susan's death occurred between midnight on Saturday, June 23, 1979, and midnight on Sunday, June 24, 1979. William and other teachers arrived in Cape Cod at 5 a.m. on Saturday and remained there until the afternoon of Monday, June 25th. However, it was unclear exactly where William was during the time of Susan's disappearance, casting doubt on his alibi. The investigation also revealed that Susan had withdrawn large sums of money from her account, totaling approximately $25,000, through multiple transactions due to daily limits. She told the bank staff that she intended to invest the money in high-yield investments managed by William, whom she referred to as her future husband. What Susan did not expect was that she was just one of many women in William's life. He was secretly dating several other people, including a co-worker who taught English, with whom he had maintained a secret relationship for nearly 10 years. William had promised Susan that the investments would yield large returns to finance their upcoming wedding and move to England. During the investigation, authorities found fake stocks and bonds in Susan's home, which initially puzzled them. They later discovered that William had sold these fake securities to Susan and then passed them on to her. These securities were mostly related to fictitious and worthless companies, suggesting that William had been deceiving Susan for a long time. This discovery added a new dimension to the case, further verifying William's financial motives. In March 1980, William was called to testify in a civil lawsuit. During his first appearance, he refused to answer questions directly and referred inquiries to his legal counsel. Although William's attorneys denied that he had taken Susan's money by June 1980, William had officially testified in court for the first time. He denied most of the allegations related to the case. insisting that his relationship with Susan was not as serious as she had told her relatives. He also denied any plans to marry Susan later that year, contrary to what Susan had shared with her close friends. William made unsubstantiated allegations about Susan's relationship with Jay Smith, the former principal of Upper Marion High School, although there was no evidence to support these claims. On the contrary, many of Susan's relatives and friends confirmed her long-term relationship with William. It should be noted that Jay Smith was in prison during the trial. William did not explain why Susan chose him as the heir to her $1 million-plus estate. Instead, he described Susan as unreliable and troubled. William also blamed Susan for her problems and claimed that he was only helping to solve them, especially in the civil lawsuit over the missing $25,000 that in June 1980, Susan's brother and ex-husband filed a separate lawsuit. They wanted to recover the entire $450,000 insurance policy that Susan had received a few weeks before her death. The intention was to put the money in a trust fund to conduct their own investigation. The case was complicated and full of unexpected events. On February 20th, 1981, William was arrested by the police on 3 charges, 2 counts of theft and 1 count of conspiracy. He was accused of keeping the $25,000 that Susan had given him to invest. William was released on bail on February 23, 1981, but his criminal trial was scheduled to begin the following month. Before the criminal trial began, the civil case was closed. It was decided that $360,000 from Susan's estate would be used to further investigate the children's disappearance and settle a dispute over the remainder of her will. This prevented William from receiving any money. On August 3, 1981, William's criminal trial lasted 5 days and ended with a guilty verdict on the theft charge. Delaware County District Attorney Edward Weiss then requested that William's bail be increased from $25,000 to $75,000. The reason was that they believed this sentence increased the risk of William fleeing, especially since there was a possibility that he would be charged with murder. Judge Robert A. Wright granted this request. That on April 6, 1983, William was arrested by the Pennsylvania State Police on several felony charges, including 3 counts of murder, attempted murder, kidnapping, conspiracy to kidnap, and obstruction of justice. The jury concluded that William knew about the plan to kill Susan and her children and was involved in the crimes. Although Jay Smith was believed to be involved, he was not charged at the time. Part of the indictment was based on the testimony of Proctor Noel, a fellow inmate, who stated that during a game of chess, William confessed to his involvement in the murders. The arrest of William Bradfield in April 1983 was a major step in the investigation of the case. Although there was no physical evidence linking William to Susan Reinert's death or the disappearance of her children, prosecutors were confident in the case. William's previous burglary convictions and his connection to the suspected body dumping site led to more serious charges. In the 1980s, Jay Smith, who was serving time for other crimes, was forced to testify before a grand jury despite invoking his Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. William Bradfield was also called to testify in 1984, but details of his testimony have not been released. The hearing was reportedly related to the disappearances of Stephanie Huntsberger and Edward Huntsberger, Jay's daughter and son-in-law. In April 1985, Jay was asked to provide handwriting samples to compare with old documents that might be related to the plan to kill Susan Reinert. This investigation led to Jay's arrest on June 25, 1985, exactly 6 years after Susan Reinert's body was found. Jay was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and held in custody while awaiting trial. They were willing to negotiate with the state to settle the matter and handle Susan's $1 million will. In 1984, Joseph Wambaugh, a well-known crime author, published a book about the case. The book supported the theory that Jay Smith was the killer. A television movie based on the book was later produced, bringing the case to national attention. Jay maintained his innocence throughout his imprisonment. He appealed and accused William Bradfield of framing him. In 1989, the court reviewed the case and found problems with the indictment, leading to a new trial. In 1990, Jay waived his right to a speedy trial to allow for a more thorough investigation. In 1992, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruled in Jay's favor, overturning the murder conviction and finding prosecutorial misconduct. For the next 2 decades, the state did not retry the case, allowing Jay to live out his life in freedom. William Bradfield continued to evade liability and refused to pay the $25,000 owed to Susan Reinert's estate. The case dragged on until 1996. Jay sued the state and Joseph Wambaugh for defamation and conspiracy, but both lawsuits were dismissed out on January 16, 1998. William Bradfield, after more than 10 years in prison, was found unconscious in his cell and died of cardiac arrest. Susan's ex-husband, Kenneth Reinert, died in June 2002 without ever knowing the fate of his two missing children. Jay Smith, who was exonerated in 1992, wrote a book about his case and remarried in 2002. He died on May 12, 2009. However, the 1978 disappearance of his daughter and son-in-law, Stephanie Huntsberger and Edward Huntsberger, remains unsolved to this day.